I'm not the kind of person who gets scared easily, but this experience left my nerves on edge. It was August, one of those endless months, and I had taken a few days off to isolate myself and finish an important work project. I chose an Airbnb in a quiet suburban neighborhood, far from the noise of the city, because I needed peace to focus. The house was simple but charming, with a brick facade and a well-kept garden. The neighborhood was so silent you could hear the wind rustling through the trees. I thought it would be perfect, but on that first night, I realized something was wrong. It started subtly. While I was cooking, I felt an odd discomfort, like someone was watching me. At first, I didn't pay much attention, but when I looked out the kitchen window, I froze. Across the street, in the window of a dimly lit house, someone was standing there. I couldn't make out their face because it was dark, but it was clearly a human figure. I stared for a few seconds, expecting them to move or walk away, but they didn't. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe a curious neighbor, but the feeling that it was more than just coincidence wouldn't leave me. I shut the curtains, thinking that would solve the problem, and tried to forget about it. Later that night, though, while watching a movie in the living room, I saw a shadow move quickly through a gap in the curtains. My heart raced. I thought it might just be my mind playing tricks on me, so I got up and peeked through the window. To my horror, the same figure was now standing on the sidewalk in front of the house. They weren't across the street anymore. It was as if they wanted me to know I was being watched. I decided not to engage. I locked all the doors and windows, closed the curtains, and tried to ignore it. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasiness. I tossed and turned all night, listening to every little noise. Around 3 a.m., I heard what sounded like faint scratching at the back door. I didn't have the courage to check it out. I grabbed my phone and kept it in my hand, ready to call the police if necessary. The feeling that I wasn't alone in that Airbnb was unbearable. The next morning, I felt ridiculous for being so paranoid. Honestly, it could have all been in my head. I went to the kitchen, still feeling tense, and noticed something strange. The curtain on the back door was slightly shifted, as if someone had moved it. I was sure I'd closed it before going to bed. When I looked closer, I saw strange smudges on the glass, like wet fingerprints. They weren't normal marks from grease or dust. It felt more deliberate. I decided to brush it off and went for a walk to clear my head. The neighborhood seemed harmless in daylight. Neatly kept houses, quiet streets, and the occasional person walking their dog. Everything seemed so normal that I started questioning whether I'd overreacted. But as I walked back to the Airbnb, I got this strange sense of déjà vu. The house where I'd seen the figure in the window the night before looked completely abandoned now. The windows were dirty, covered in grime, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. I felt confused. How could someone have been there watching me? Back at the Airbnb, my mind was racing. I spent the day distracted, trying to focus on my work, but every small noise in the house felt magnified. My paranoia was growing, and the evening arrived too quickly. As soon as the sun set, I closed all the curtains and double-checked every lock. I wanted to feel safe, but something inside me said it wouldn't be enough. I decided not to stay in the living room this time and locked myself in the bedroom. Strangely, even with the curtains closed, I still felt like I was being watched. Around midnight, something happened that I can't explain to this day. I was in the bedroom trying to distract myself with videos on my phone when I heard a sound coming from the kitchen. It was a soft click, almost imperceptible. My heart was pounding. I grabbed a knife from the nightstand, the only weapon I had, and went to the bedroom door. I forced myself to listen carefully. The sound grew louder, like someone was messing with the back door handle. I didn't know if it was fear or adrenaline keeping me upright, but every sound felt amplified in my head. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to convince myself to open the bedroom door. The clicking at the handle stopped, but it was replaced by something even more unnerving. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone was walking around the kitchen. My heart raced. The wooden floors of the house creaked with each step, and I could pinpoint exactly where the person was. I didn't dare step out, so with trembling hands, I dialed 911. I explained the situation as best I could, but the operator's tone was so casual it felt like I was reporting something trivial. "We'll send a unit to check it out," they said, hanging up before I could press for more details. While I waited, I stayed pressed against the door, gripping the knife like it was my lifeline. The footsteps eventually stopped, and the silence that followed was almost worse. I could feel the presence outside the bedroom, but I couldn't bring myself to confirm it. When I finally heard the siren in the distance, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Peeking through the curtain, I saw the blue lights flashing on the street, but that relief was short-lived. As soon as I heard the officers knocking on the front door, the sound of footsteps returned, this time running toward the back of the house. My breath caught in my throat. I opened the bedroom door cautiously, still clutching the knife, and made my way toward the kitchen. The officer was still calling from outside, but something told me not to unlock the door until I was sure the house was empty. When I reached the kitchen, I felt a chill run through me. The back door was wide open, letting in the cold night air. There was no one there, but something on the floor caught my attention. Muddy footprints. They didn't look normal. They were barefoot, but the toes were unusually long, almost claw-like. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it, but nothing added up. I closed the door quickly and locked it before heading to let the officers inside. The two officers entered the house and started asking the usual questions. Had I seen anyone? How long had this been happening? And if I could describe the intruder. I told them everything, from seeing the figure in the window to hearing footsteps in the kitchen. They checked the house, but as I feared, they didn't find anyone. When I mentioned the footprints in the kitchen, one of them looked skeptical, while the other asked to see them. When we got to the kitchen, the prints were still on the floor. The expression on his face changed instantly. A mix of confusion and something I can only describe as unease. "This doesn't look human," he muttered under his breath, while his partner scanned the room visibly on edge. They decided to check out the abandoned house across the street, since it seemed to be where everything had started. They told me to stay inside the Airbnb and lock the doors. I agreed without hesitation. As they crossed the street, I watched from the window, my chest tight with anxiety. Their flashlights illuminated the grimy windows of the house. After a few minutes, they went inside. The seconds felt like hours. I couldn't take my eyes off the house. Their flashlights moved back and forth inside, but suddenly they stopped. They stayed still for a moment, and then one of them went dark. My heart raced. I waited to hear something, maybe a shout or even the two of them coming back out. But the silence was deafening. I grabbed my phone and called 911 again, trying to explain what was happening, but all they said was that another unit was on the way. Meanwhile, I stood frozen, staring at the dark house. After a few agonizing minutes, I saw one of the officers emerge. He was running, his flashlight shaking in his hand. When he reached the street, he glanced back quickly, like he was fleeing from something. The other officer didn't follow. Before I could process what was happening, the one who returned got into the patrol car and sped off without even looking in my direction or back at the house. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was as if he had abandoned his partner. A wave of desperation hit me, and all I wanted was to get out of there as fast as I could. After the officer drove off, the silence returned to the street. My first instinct was to grab my stuff and leave, but I had nowhere to go at that hour. Adrenaline coursed through my veins, making my body shake, and every noise in the house felt deafening. A few more minutes passed before another patrol car arrived. This time, 3 officers stepped out, and they looked confused when they realized their colleague was no longer there. I tried to explain what had happened, but they barely listened. "Stay inside and don't open the door for anyone," one of them said before heading to the abandoned house. I didn't know what to think anymore. Everything was so far from normal that my brain was exhausted from trying to make sense of it. I anxiously watched for any sign of the officers, but soon their flashlights disappeared inside the house. For a moment I considered running away on foot, but the fear of encountering whatever was out there kept me frozen. Then, suddenly, the lights in the house across the street began to flicker, as if someone was flipping a switch repeatedly. It was frantic, and I knew it wasn't something the officers would do. Panic consumed me entirely. I called 911 again, but the person on the other end sounded disconnected, almost like they couldn't hear me properly. Then I heard something that chilled me to the bone. The sound of the back door opening again. I grabbed the knife I'd kept in the bedroom and locked myself in the bathroom. The footsteps in the house were louder this time, heavier and more deliberate, as if someone knew exactly where I was. Breathing was almost impossible. With each step closer, it felt like my heart would burst. When the footsteps stopped outside the bathroom door, I thought it was the end. I stood there motionless, trying not to make a sound, but the door didn't open. Instead, I heard a strange scratching noise, like long nails dragging across the wood. My phone vibrated, nearly making me scream in fright. It was a text message. "Get out now! Run!" I didn't recognize the number, but I didn't need any more convincing. Summoning all my courage, I opened the bathroom window and climbed out. As soon as I landed in the backyard, I twisted my ankle, but I didn't stop. The pain was excruciating, but fear pushed me forward. I ran as fast as I could without looking back until I reached the street. The neighborhood, which had seemed so peaceful before, now felt consumed by an oppressive atmosphere. There were no lights in the houses, no signs of life, just darkness and the sound of my ragged breathing. In the distance, I saw a light, the neon sign of a convenience store. Without hesitation, I sprinted toward it, every step feeling like something was chasing me. When I finally burst into the store, the clerk jumped, startled by my entrance. He looked confused but didn't ask questions. I begged to use the phone and called 911 again, desperately trying to explain what had happened. This time, the response I got was even more unsettling. "The unit you mentioned already responded and found nothing. Everything is in order." I didn't know what to say. I tried to tell them about the officers who went into the house, but they insisted there was no record of any calls in that area. I knew I had to leave. The next morning, under the safety of daylight, I returned to the Airbnb to collect my belongings. To my relief, there was no one there. The footprints in the kitchen had vanished, as if they'd never been there. The house looked exactly as it had when I arrived, but I knew I'd never step foot inside again. I messaged the host to say I'd left early and made up an excuse. I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth. To this day, I don't know what that was. Maybe I never will. All I know is that the figure watching me from the house across the street and the sounds inside the Airbnb still haunt my dreams. Whenever someone asks about strange experiences, I share this story, but it always sends chills down my spine. I can't explain it. All I know is that something was there with me that night, and it wasn't human. Since then, I've never been able to stay alone in a rental house again, and honestly, I don't plan to. As he walked back toward the store, I noticed a dark stain on the side of his shirt, near his waist. It was a deep red, dried enough not to look fresh, but still noticeable. It didn't seem like the kind of grime you'd expect from someone working at a gas station. I stood there for a few seconds, trying not to stare, but my mind was racing. Just before he went into the convenience store, he glanced back over his shoulder, and that wide smile was gone. In its place was a strange expression, a mix of alertness and anticipation, like he wanted to make sure I was still there. I tried to act like nothing was wrong and went back to my car, attempting to steady my breathing. When I opened the door, a reflection on the side of the vehicle caught my eye. The dim light from the lamppost illuminated a fresh, slick trail of something on my rear tire. Something like oil or grease. My heart sank. Had he done something to the car while I wasn't looking? I crouched down quickly, running my hand along the surface to figure out what it was, but the chemical smell made me pull back. It wasn't just motor oil. It was thicker, with an almost acidic odor. Before I could process what was happening, I heard footsteps behind me. I jumped up, and there he was, standing just a few feet away. "Everything okay over here?" he asked, his tone lower now, less cheerful. He was holding a dirty rag in his hands like he'd just wiped something off. But what unsettled me most was how close he was. There was no reason for him to come back so quickly unless he'd been watching me. "Yeah, just checking the tires. You know how it is on long drives," I replied, trying to sound casual, but even I could hear the tension in my voice. He nodded, but didn't move. For a few seconds, it felt like we were locked in a silent standoff, each waiting for the other to make the next move. I decided to get in the car, hoping it was all just paranoia. I turned the key in the ignition, but the engine sputtered and died. I tried again, and nothing. The attendant stepped closer, tilting his head like a curious animal. "Oh, looks like your car's got a problem. Lucky for you, I'm here, huh?" he said, his tone now laced with something almost mocking. That's when I realized he wanted exactly this. For me to be stuck there. My heart was pounding, but I knew I couldn't show it. I nodded with a forced smile, trying to seem relieved. "Yeah, lucky me, right?" I said, attempting to keep the conversation light. He smiled back, but there was something predatory in that grin, like he already knew what was going to happen next. "Let me take a look under the hood for you," he offered, already moving toward the front of the car without waiting for my answer. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The idea of letting him touch the car terrified me. But what could I do? He had me cornered, and the road was too empty to risk running off on foot. I stayed in the driver's seat, watching through the rearview mirror as he lifted the hood. He moved with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. Quick hands, but those eyes. They kept darting back to me, like he was waiting for something. Then I noticed something that made my stomach twist even more. Under his fingernails was dried residue that looked like blood, contrasting grotesquely with the grease on his hands. I could practically hear my pulse pounding in my ears as I tried to think of a way to get out of there without raising suspicion. After a few minutes of fiddling with the engine, he slammed the hood shut with a loud bang that echoed in the empty station. "Yeah, this'll be hard to fix now. But there's a shop nearby. I can take you there," he said with a calmness that felt rehearsed. There was no reason for me to trust him, but staying there didn't seem like an option either. I looked around, trying to find an excuse, any excuse, to buy some time. That's when I spotted the old sedan parked nearby. My curiosity got the better of me, and I asked, "Is that car yours?" He hesitated for a moment, and that slight pause in his response was all I needed to confirm something was wrong. "Oh no, that's a customer's car. Left it here. I'm waiting for them to come back," he said, but his casual tone didn't match the anxious glance he shot toward the vehicle. I decided to take a risk. I got out of my car under the pretense of stretching my legs and slowly walked toward the sedan. With every step, I could feel his eyes burning into my back, but I kept going. When I got close, I peered through the dusty window and felt my stomach drop. On the back seat was an open backpack with scattered clothes and a wallet tossed carelessly inside. I grabbed my phone to shine a light on it and saw an ID. It belonged to a woman, and her birth date suggested she wasn't young. She looked like someone who could have been my mom. I didn't have much time to think. The attendant started walking toward me, his footsteps heavy and deliberate, like he wanted to stop me from looking any further. "Hey, I don't think you should mess with that. You know, it's not really your business," he said, his tone a mix of nervousness and warning. My heart was racing, but I tried to stay calm. "Oh, I was just seeing if there was anything useful. Maybe jumper cables or tools, I said, improvising on the spot. He stopped in his tracks, as if deciding whether to believe me. Back at my car, he kept insisting on driving me to the supposed repair shop, but I knew I couldn't go with him. I think I'll wait a bit. Maybe the engine just needs to cool down, I said, trying to sound casual. He didn't seem happy with my answer, but he didn't push further. That's when I saw my chance. While he wandered back toward the convenience store, I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, speaking quietly and quickly. I gave them my location and told them something strange was happening. The dispatcher assured me that a patrol car was on the way. Minutes later, as the attendant hovered near the pumps, a blue light flickered in the distance. The moment he noticed it, his expression changed completely. He dropped the rag he was holding and bolted into the convenience store. The police arrived fast and 2 officers stepped out, armed and alert. I explained everything I'd seen and heard, pointing to the sedan and my sabotaged car. They entered the store, but the attendant had already slipped out the back, vanishing into the woods surrounding the station. Later, I found out that the sedan was registered to a woman who had been missing for weeks. After that night, I sold my car and swore off driving alone on empty roads. The officers said they found tools and suspicious items at the station, but they never confirmed if the attendant was caught. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, haunted by the memory of his stare, and how close I came to something much worse. The most unsettling part is that no one could explain how the station kept operating in the middle of nowhere, with no maintenance or other staff. All I know is that, to this day, I can't pass by a 24-hour gas station sign without a shiver running down my spine. I've always been one of those guys who likes exploring abandoned places, just out of sheer boredom. Growing up in a small town without much to do, exploring forgotten spots became kind of a hobby for me. Back then, I was 19 and living with my parents. My friend Jake, who was always up for an adventure, was my partner in crime for these explorations. One fall afternoon, we heard about this abandoned subdivision on the outskirts of town. An entire neighborhood with paved streets and light poles, but the houses were never finished. It sounded perfect for our next escapade. We left home late in the afternoon, under that orange autumn sky. We grabbed our bikes and rode for about 20 minutes before we got there. The entrance was blocked with no trespassing signs and a rusty chain on the gate. Of course, that didn't stop us. We found a gap in the fence where it had been cut and slipped through. The silence inside was almost deafening, like the place itself was holding its breath. The houses were all identical, gray concrete walls with broken windows. Some were covered in graffiti, others overgrown with weeds, but one house caught our attention right away. There were lights flickering inside. "That's impossible," I muttered to Jake, pointing at it. There was no way the place still had power. The electricity should have been shut off years ago. He shrugged, but I could see the hesitation in his eyes. Still, we headed toward the house, each step crunching leaves underfoot, as if we were crossing into forbidden territory. As we got closer, we realized the flickering light was coming from a lamp in the living room. The window was shattered, so we could see everything clearly. Inside, the place was a mess, like someone had been living there recently. "Check this out," I whispered, pointing at an empty chip bag on the floor. Jake frowned and climbed through the window without a second thought. I hesitated but eventually followed him. The smell inside was weird, musty with a faint hint of something freshly eaten. "Do you think someone's staying here?" I asked, my voice shaky. Jake gave a short laugh, but there was something off about his expression. We started looking around, each step revealing more signs that the house wasn't as empty as it seemed. It felt like whoever had been there had left in a hurry. As we walked around the living room, an unsettling feeling crept in. It wasn't just the fact that we were trespassing in what seemed to be someone's space. It was the silence. There was something off about it, heavier than it should have been. Jake crouched down to pick up the chip bag from the floor. It looked surprisingly clean. No dust, like it had been dropped just days ago. "This is weird," he muttered under his breath, turning the bag in his hands. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. You know that eerie sensation when you just know someone's eyes are on you, even if you don't see them? That's exactly how I felt. We decided to explore the rest of the house, because of course, we were two idiots too curious for our own good. We moved into the kitchen and found more food wrappers scattered around, along with a half-empty water bottle sitting on the counter. The strangest thing was how deliberate it all looked, like someone wanted us to know they had been there. But who in their right mind would live in a place like this? Jake pointed at the staircase leading to the second floor. "Want to check upstairs?" he asked, already putting one foot on the first step. I wanted to say no, to turn around and leave, but for some reason I followed him. The stairs creaked with every step, amplifying the sound of our movements in the stillness. The dim light from the lamp downstairs barely reached the upper floor, so we used the flashlights on our phones. The upstairs hallway smelled worse, like mildew mixed with something metallic I couldn't identify. The doors to the bedrooms were all open except for one at the end of the hall. The doorknob was rusty but looked like it had been used recently. There were smudges, like fingerprints on it. Jake looked back at me with a "should we" kind of expression, and before I could answer, he pushed the door open. The room was small and empty, except for a mattress on the floor and a notebook lying open in the middle of it. I froze at the doorway, unable to step inside, while Jake walked straight to the notebook. He crouched and started flipping through it. "It's like a diary," he said, his voice hesitant. I asked what it said, but he didn't answer right away. He turned a few more pages before finally saying, "This doesn't make sense. It's all scribbles, but it looks like instructions?" Before I could process what he meant, we heard the sound of footsteps downstairs. Jake froze, still holding the notebook, and we exchanged a look that said it all. We weren't alone. The sound of footsteps made my heart race. It was like the air in the room had been sucked out, leaving only the pounding of blood in my ears. Jake dropped the notebook onto the mattress and stood up so fast he nearly tripped. We stood there for a few seconds, straining to hear anything else, but everything went silent again. "It's probably just the wind," he whispered, but his voice trembled, and I could tell he was trying to convince himself more than me. But that didn't sound like wind. It was too distinct, too deliberate. Someone had entered the house. Jake motioned for us to leave the room, but I hesitated. There was something about the notebook, those scribbled pages, that felt like they were calling us back. Still, I followed him into the hallway, and we started making our way down the stairs as quietly as we could. Every step seemed to amplify the creaking under our weight, and I couldn't help but wonder if whoever was downstairs already knew we were there. When we reached the bottom step, we noticed something new. The front door, which had been wide open when we entered, was now closed. "This isn't right," I whispered, and Jake gave me a quick, anxious glance that said he felt the same. Then we heard it, a loud clatter coming from the kitchen, like a pot or something metal falling to the floor. Jake grabbed my arm, and I nearly screamed from the shock, but he motioned for me to stay quiet. We crept toward the kitchen doorway, moving slowly, peeking through the gap. What we saw made my blood run cold. In the middle of the kitchen stood a figure, back turned to us, rigid and slightly tilting its head, as if listening to something far away. The dim light from Jake's phone flashlight barely illuminated the figure, but I could make out a dirty, tattered jacket. The silence returned, but it was suffocating now. Before we could think of what to do, the figure moved. Not like a normal person. It was a jerky, abrupt motion, almost like it had been yanked by invisible strings. It turned its head toward us, but the face was obscured by what looked like a mask made of random scraps of cloth, stitched together haphazardly. Without a second thought, Jake grabbed my arm and bolted toward the front door. I didn't look back, but I could hear heavy footsteps chasing after us, far too fast to be human. The sound of my own screams echoed as we struggled to yank the door open. It felt stuck, like something was holding it shut, keeping us inside. The door finally gave way, and we bolted outside as if our lives depended on it. And maybe they did. The cold night air hit us like a punch, but we didn't slow down for a second. The only thing on my mind was getting as far away from that place as possible. Behind us, the sound of footsteps seemed to blend with the wind, but I didn't dare look back. When we finally made it through the gap in the fence where we had entered, we stopped to catch our breath, gasping and shaking like we'd just escaped a nightmare. Jake collapsed onto the ground, trying to breathe, while I turned back to look at the subdivision one last time. Everything was dark again. The house with the flickering light now looked like just another unfinished empty structure, as if nothing had ever happened. "What the hell was that?" Jake asked, but I didn't have an answer. The silence that followed was even more unsettling now, as if the entire area was mocking us. I was about to suggest we leave when something near the bushes caught my eye. It was the notebook. It must have fallen out of Jake's hands while we were running. Against my better judgment, I walked over and picked it up. The scribbled pages were still there, but something had changed. At the bottom of one of the pages, a new sentence had appeared. Written in shaky, uneven letters, it read, "You shouldn't have come." My stomach churned, and I dropped the notebook back onto the ground, stumbling away like it was about to bite me. Jake looked at me, confused, but I just shook my head. "Leave it. Let's go. Now." We rode our bikes back to town in complete silence. Neither of us brought up what we had seen that night. Not the figure in the kitchen, not the footsteps, and definitely not the notebook. It was like we had made an unspoken pact to never talk about it again. But even after all these years, I can't forget the sound of those footsteps behind us, or the feeling of being watched with every step we took. Sometimes, when I pass by that area, I feel an overwhelming urge to go back, like something is still calling out to me. But to this day, I've never had the courage. I've never been the type to believe in ghost stories or urban legends, but after what happened to me, I can't brush them off anymore. This was back in July 2019. I had taken a week off work and decided to do something I'd always wanted: a solo camping trip in Shenandoah National Park. I had some experience hiking and camping in groups, but never alone. The plan was to spend 3 days away from everything. No phone, no internet, just me and nature. The first day went great. I woke up early, packed the essentials: tent, dehydrated food, flashlight, and a pocket knife my dad gave me, and started the trail around noon. The path was easy, the kind even kids could hike, but after a few hours the trees grew denser, and sunlight barely filtered through the leaves. That's when things started to feel off. By the middle of the second day, as I climbed a steeper incline, I noticed something pinned to a tree. It was a piece of paper, torn at the edges, fastened with a broken twig jammed hard into the bark. The message was handwritten, the letters shaky, like someone had scribbled it in a hurry or under stress. "Leave now." I found it odd, but not particularly scary. It seemed like the kind of prank someone might pull to mess with tourists. I pocketed the paper, thinking I'd show it to a ranger when I got back, and kept walking. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who would leave a note like that in the middle of nowhere? And why? That's when I realized how quiet it had gotten. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my boots on the trail. Further down the path, I came across something that made me stop. Off the trail, a bit hidden among the trees, was a tent. It was old, torn on one side, like some animal had clawed at it. The ground around it was a mess: crushed food cans, shredded clothes, some of them ripped like they'd been grabbed in a fight. I approached cautiously, calling out, "Hello? Anyone here?" No response. I crouched to peek inside the tent, but it was empty. Just an open backpack with dirty clothes and a small notebook. Its pages crumpled and water-stained, like it had been there for days. The last words written in it were barely legible, but I managed to make out, "They are here." Who were they? Anxiety started to creep in, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the camper had an emergency and left in a rush. That's all, right? Even with the strange feeling nagging at me, I decided to keep going. Turning back felt like overreacting. Nothing dangerous had happened. I continued up the trail, but with every step, the sense of being watched grew stronger. You know that feeling? Like someone's eyes are on you even when you're alone? It was like that, but worse. I started glancing behind me more often, but nothing was there. Occasionally, I thought I heard faint footsteps, light and distant, but when I stopped to listen, there was nothing. The sound of my own boots crunching the dirt seemed unnaturally loud, and I couldn't shake the unease settling in my chest. The trail got narrower and steeper, and the trees seemed to close in around me. At every bend, I glanced over my shoulder expecting to see something, or someone following me, but the path remained empty. That's when I heard it. A whistle. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A long, drawn-out note, like someone calling a dog. I froze mid-step, holding my breath to listen again. There it was, but this time, it sounded a little closer, though still muffled, like it was coming from deeper in the forest. My first thought was that it might be another hiker or someone from the area, but why would anyone be whistling like that out here? I tried to shake it off and kept walking, but my pace slowed, and sweat started to cling to my back. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't help but feel like something was wrong. About an hour later, I reached a small plateau and decided to take a break. I set up my tent near a large rock for cover, and started preparing something to eat. As I stirred the dehydrated food in a pot, my mind wandered back to what I had seen earlier, the abandoned tent, the note on the tree. I tried to reason with myself. It could have been a group of kids playing a prank or a camper who ran into some trouble. But then, just as I was about to take a bite, I heard the whistle again. This time, it was closer, maybe less than 50 feet away. I dropped everything and stood up, scanning the trees with my flashlight. "Hello? Is someone out there?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. Just silence, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I decided I needed to check it out, if only to prove to myself that it was nothing. I grabbed my flashlight and the pocket knife, walking cautiously toward where I thought the sound had come from. For a few minutes, I followed the beam of light, moving as quietly as I could, but my heart was pounding so loudly it felt like it might drown out everything else. Then the whistling stopped. I paused, scanning my surroundings, and that's when I saw them. Footprints. They weren't mine. They were bigger, uneven, like someone had been dragging a foot as they walked. The prints looked fresh, heading away from my camp. A chill ran down my spine as I realized they hadn't been there earlier. Someone, or something, had been there while I was setting up. I hurried back to the tent, my hands shaking as I tried to keep my flashlight steady. When I got there, my blood ran cold. The tent, which I had left zipped shut, was open. The sides were slashed, like someone had taken a knife or claws to it. My backpack, which had been inside, was overturned, and my food was scattered on the ground. The only thing untouched was the notebook I had found earlier, still sitting on the rock where I had left it. I picked it up and flipped through it again, scanning the pages. This time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. On the back of one of the pages, there was a crude drawing. It was a tall, humanoid figure, thin with unnaturally long arms and a disproportionately large head. Below the drawing, one word was scrawled in shaky letters. Run. After seeing that drawing, a wave of panic hit me. I couldn't rationalize what was happening anymore. There was something out there with me, and whatever it was, it clearly didn't want me there. I started breaking down my tent as quickly as I could, shoving everything into my backpack without caring about organization. My plan was simple: head back down the trail as fast as possible and get to my car, even if it meant hiking through the night. As I packed, I noticed something different in the air. It was like the silence had gained weight. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive void that seemed to press down on me. My breathing grew heavier, and I turned around several times, expecting to see something lurking between the trees. But all I saw was darkness. I started down the trail with my flashlight in hand, focusing on the path ahead. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder, convinced I'd see something following me. That's when I heard a sound that froze me in my tracks. Footsteps. They were rhythmic but strangely uneven, like someone was limping or dragging a leg. The sound came from behind me, maybe 30 or 40 feet away. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew that in the dark, running could be dangerous. I tried to stay calm and kept walking, but now every step felt like an eternity. The footsteps continued, always at the same distance, like a shadow that wouldn't leave me alone. Occasionally they seemed to grow louder, and I quickened my pace, fighting the urge to look back. After almost an hour of walking, I reached a fork in the trail that I didn't remember seeing before. It confused me because I was certain I was on the right path. There were two options. One was wider and well-maintained, while the other was narrower, with branches partially blocking the way. Something told me to take the wider path, but a part of me hesitated. As I stood there trying to decide, I heard that whistle again, but this time it was much closer, almost as if it were right behind me. My heart pounded, and without thinking, I turned onto the narrow path. I didn't know if it was the right decision, but anything felt better than standing there, frozen in fear. The narrow trail was harder to navigate, with roots and rocks everywhere, but I pressed on. The feeling of being watched was so intense, it felt like my neck was burning. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow, quick and low, darting between the trees. I stopped, gripping my flashlight tightly, and pointed it toward where I'd seen the movement. Nothing, just trees and undergrowth. But I knew what I'd seen, or at least I thought I did. Before I could react, I heard a noise behind me, the sound of branches snapping. Without thinking, I started running. I didn't care about the risk of tripping or getting hurt. All I wanted was to get out of there alive. I've never been too picky about where I stay, as long as it's cheap and the bed is decent. Back in 2019, I was in this phase of exploring small towns, trying to avoid the typical tourist traps. I'd just taken some time off work and needed to get away from the office. I found an Airbnb in a neighborhood that, according to the listing, was up and coming. You know, the kind of phrase that sounds like a nice way of saying it still had its issues, but was starting to feel charming. The place looked nice enough, an old renovated townhouse with a hipster vibe, and the price was amazing. I was excited, especially since the reviews were great, and the host, a guy named Mark, seemed friendly and helpful. I got there in the late afternoon after a 4-hour drive. The neighborhood was a mix of things, a few abandoned buildings here and there, but also some fancy coffee shops with French names. The townhouse itself was better than I expected. A pale blue exterior with a charming porch covered in plants. Inside, it had that modern meets vintage vibe. Exposed brick walls, dark wood furniture, and big windows. Mark greeted me at the door with a big smile, shaking my hand like we were old friends. He made a point to show me everything. How the lights worked, where the heater was, even the Wi-Fi password. "Make yourself at home," he said, and it seemed genuine. That evening, everything was going smoothly. I ordered food from a local spot and ate while watching a show in the living room. It was a quiet night, and the street outside was almost empty. There was something a bit eerie about the silence, but I tried to brush it off. New neighborhoods can be like that, right? After the show ended, I headed upstairs to the bedroom. The room was cozy, with a soft mattress and a warm yellowish glow from a bedside lamp. I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the drive. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, unsure why. The room was dark, except for a sliver of light coming from under the door. I stayed still for a moment, listening. That's when I heard it. Footsteps on the stairs. My heart started pounding. It wasn't my imagination. The sound was clear, deliberate, like someone was trying to move quietly, but the creaky wood betrayed them. My body froze. I tried to convince myself it was just some noise from outside, or maybe the house settling. But the steps continued, slow and steady, getting closer to the second floor. My first instinct was to hold my breath. Each step seemed louder in my head, and with every sound I kept wondering, who could it be? I thought about Mark, but he had been clear that he didn't live in the house and wouldn't be coming back. In fact, he'd made it a point to say I'd have the place to myself. Still, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he'd forgotten something important and needed to come back. Or maybe it was someone from the neighborhood trying to break in by mistake. While these thoughts raced through my mind, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. I knew I had to check. The mix of curiosity and fear was almost unbearable. I got out of bed as slowly as possible, trying not to make a sound, and walked toward the door. I pressed my ear against it, straining to hear anything outside. Nothing. I thought about cracking the door open just a bit, but my heart was beating so fast it felt impossible to keep my hands steady. I grabbed my phone and opened the camera app, sliding it through the gap under the door to try and see something. The screen showed an empty hallway, dimly lit by the light from downstairs. No movement at all. That's when I heard the voice. Low, like a whisper, but clear enough to make me jump back from the door. "Is everything okay up there?" My blood ran cold. The voice came from downstairs, as if someone was calling out to me. I recognized it immediately. It was Mark. But the way he spoke didn't sound quite normal. I can't explain it, but there was something off about his tone. Something forced, almost sinister. "Are you awake?" he repeated, a little louder this time. I didn't answer. I was frozen, trying to process it. Why was he there? And why, for the love of God, hadn't he told me he was coming back? After a few seconds, I heard the sound of something being dragged, followed by more footsteps, this time moving back down the stairs. The sound faded, and silence returned. Every instinct in me was screaming to get out of there, but part of me still wanted to believe there was a logical explanation. Maybe he was just checking on me, making sure everything was okay. After all, he had seemed so considerate before. Even so, I decided I wasn't going downstairs to find out. I locked the bedroom door, pushed a chair against it, and sat on the bed clutching my phone, waiting for morning. The hours that followed were the longest of my life. I sat there on the bed, holding my phone tightly, checking the time every few minutes. The silence was unbearable. Every little sound, the creak of the wood, the wind outside, sent my heart racing. I tried distracting myself with random things on my phone, but my mind kept replaying Mark's voice and those footsteps. What was he doing? Why did he come upstairs only to go back down so quickly? Every time I thought about the tone of his voice, a shiver ran down my spine. Something about it. It just wasn't right. When the first rays of sunlight finally started peeking through the window, I worked up the courage to leave the room. I opened the door slowly, every movement feeling louder than it should have been in the quiet house. The hallway was empty, bathed in the soft glow of morning light, but I still felt on edge. I tiptoed down the stairs, each step creaking under my weight, making me flinch. When I reached the living room, everything was exactly as I'd left it the night before, except for the front door, which was slightly ajar. My heart sank. The door hadn't been like that when I went to bed. Someone had left. Or worse, Someone might still be outside waiting. I did a quick sweep of the house, trying to look brave, but my eyes kept darting toward the shadows. The kitchen was untouched, no signs of a break-in or anything out of place. Finally, I went to the front door and closed it gently, locking it this time. I grabbed my things, deciding I wasn't going to stick around. Whoever or whatever had been in that house last night, I wanted no part of it. Before leaving, I sent Mark a message through the Airbnb app. I tried to keep it polite but direct. "Hi Mark, I think there might have been some confusion. Did you come by the house last night? I'm going to check out early. Hope you understand." I waited a few minutes for a reply, but nothing came. I got in my car and drove off as fast as I could. As I was pulling onto the main road, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was Mark's reply. "I wasn't there last night. Is everything okay? Maybe you heard something from the neighborhood." I never responded. At that moment, I knew I was never setting foot in that house again. Even after I left, the unease didn't go away. I spent hours in the car, replaying every detail of the night. The idea that Mark might be lying crossed my mind, but something about his message felt genuine. Then again, what if it wasn't him? What if someone else had access to the house? I started questioning the whole up-and-coming neighborhood thing. Maybe it was just a cover for an area that wasn't entirely safe. But still, those footsteps on the stairs, that voice, none of it made sense. When I finally checked into a hotel far from that town, I tried to move on with my trip, but the memory kept gnawing at me. I decided to dig through the Airbnb reviews to see if anyone else had experienced anything similar. Most of the comments about Mark were glowing, thoughtful, friendly, great host. But buried in the middle, I found one review that made my stomach drop. Someone mentioned strange occurrences during their stay. Doors that seemed to open on their own, footsteps from upstairs. But they hadn't thought much of it at the time. The review ended with, "Still, it was a pleasant stay." I didn't have the nerve to write about my experience publicly, but I sent an email to Airbnb detailing everything that happened, including Mark's message denying he'd been there. I never got a clear response, just a generic email saying they would investigate the matter. A few months later, Mark's listing disappeared from the platform, but I never found out why. To this day, I catch myself thinking about that night. If it wasn't Mark, who was in the house? And if it was him, why would he lie? Either way, something about that house wasn't right. And honestly, I'd rather never know. I've always loved camping. It was my way of escaping the routine, disconnecting from my phone, and just soaking in the sounds of nature. That summer, I decided to visit a popular campsite near a nature reserve with breathtaking stargazing views. I'd heard about the place for years, with its trails and waterfalls, so I finally took the chance. I arrived late Friday afternoon, planning to spend the weekend alone. Nothing beats the peace of being surrounded by nature, with no one to bother you. At least, that's what I thought. I pitched my tent in a more secluded spot, away from the main camping area where families and large groups were gathered. From where I was, I could hear the soft trickle of the creek and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Everything seemed perfect until just after dark, as I was preparing some food over the fire, I heard footsteps approaching. I turned my head and saw a man walking toward me. He had an old, worn-out backpack and a floppy hat that covered half his face. "Evening," he said, flashing a smile that felt a little too wide for the moment. I'll admit I was a little wary, but he seemed friendly, so I waved and greeted him back. He introduced himself as Rick and said he was also camping nearby and had seen my fire from a distance. Without much thought, I invited him to sit and share some coffee I had just made. He accepted right away, almost like he'd been expecting the invitation. As we talked, he began telling stories about other campgrounds he'd visited, encounters with wildlife, and even some strange situations he claimed to have experienced. It was all intriguing, but something about the way he told them felt exaggerated, like he was trying too hard to impress me. After a while, Rick started asking me questions. At first they were harmless. If it was my first time at this campsite, where I was from, what I did for a living. I answered casually, but as the conversation went on, he began mentioning things I hadn't told him. He made a comment about how great it must be to work remotely and travel often. Something I did but hadn't brought up. Then he said it must be nice to escape the chaos of a big city like mine. That's when a chill ran down my spine. How did he know that? I racked my brain trying to remember if I'd let something slip, but I was sure I hadn't. I let out a nervous laugh and tried to steer the conversation in another direction. I asked where he had set up his tent, and he vaguely pointed north, saying he was in a hidden spot near some tall trees. I found that odd because I had walked through that area earlier and hadn't seen any tents or signs of someone camping there. Still, I kept the conversation going, trying to stay polite. By this point, the fire was burning lower, and the shadows on his face seemed to shift unnaturally with the flickering flames. My unease grew, but I didn't want to seem rude or escalate the situation. Then Rick started telling a story about a nearby campsite where something really strange had happened. He described in vivid detail a case of someone disappearing during the night, leaving behind a perfectly intact tent with all their belongings scattered inside, as if they had fled in a panic. The way he described it was so precise, almost like he had been there. The authorities never found anything, except for a pair of boots near the creek. Kind of like yours, he added with a laugh. I froze. I was wearing brand new hiking boots, something I also hadn't mentioned to him. I started thinking of excuses to end the conversation. I glanced at the sky and pretended to yawn, saying I needed to rest early to make the most of the trails the next day. He stared at me for a few seconds, the smile slowly fading from his face, before finally standing up. Sure. It's always good to rest. You never know when you'll need extra energy, he said, almost as if he were warning me. The way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. He stubbed out a cigarette I hadn't even noticed he was smoking, waved goodbye, and disappeared into the darkness as quietly as he had arrived. I spent the next few minutes listening to the sounds of the forest, straining to hear any sign he was still nearby. Nothing, just the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves. Even so, something inside me told me he hadn't really left. I zipped up the tent and tied the zipper in a tight knot. I tried to lie down, but I couldn't relax. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the bushes sent my heart racing. I stared at the ceiling of the tent, my mind conjuring the worst scenarios. Who was this guy? How did he know so much about me? The hours dragged on. Outside, the forest seemed restless, as if the very branches and leaves had come alive. The sound of the creek, which had been soothing earlier, now seemed unnervingly close, almost too loud. The feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me alone. I grabbed my flashlight and peeked through the small opening of the tent. I swept the beam across the trees, but everything seemed normal. The pale yellow light illuminated thick trunks, but there was no sign of movement. Still, the sense of danger lingered, like an invisible hand tightening around my chest. I was about to lie down again when I heard footsteps. This time, they weren't light or random like those of a small animal. They were firm, deliberate, heading straight toward my tent. My heart pounded, and I instinctively turned off the flashlight, trying to remain as silent as possible. Through the sounds of the wind and leaves, I clearly heard someone stop just a few feet away. I held my breath, straining to hear any other noise. Then, almost like a whisper carried by the night, I heard a voice. "I know you're in there." My eyes widened, and a chill ran through my body. It was Rick's voice, but it sounded different, calmer, almost unnervingly so. I didn't respond, but the silence seemed to encourage him to keep talking. "You think you're alone, but we're never truly alone out here. Not in this place. My mind was racing, trying to decide what to do. If I screamed, no one would hear me. If I ran, he might be waiting for that. All I could do was stay frozen, listening to every word he said, as if they were stones dropping into a bottomless well. After a few minutes, the sound of footsteps returned, this time moving away. I stayed paralyzed, listening until the silence was absolute. I had no idea if he had really left, or if it was some kind of trap, but I knew I couldn't spend the rest of the night there. I grabbed my backpack, my keys, and everything I could carry quickly. I partially dismantled the tent to avoid leaving anything behind, but did it all in the dark, with the flashlight off. My only goal was to leave as quietly and quickly as possible. Once I was ready, I started walking toward the trail leading out. The trail felt endless in the dark. Every step I took seemed to echo in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The silence of the forest was almost more unsettling than the sound of footsteps. My only comfort was the small flashlight I had set to its dimmest mode, just enough to avoid tripping. Every so often I stopped to listen. Nothing. But the sense of being watched clung to me, persistent, like a shadow that wouldn't let go. I tried convincing myself it was just fear playing tricks on me, but it didn't help. When I finally reached the parking lot, I exhaled a shaky breath of relief. My car was exactly where I'd left it, its dull paint reflecting the faint glow of the moon. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. Before driving off, I couldn't resist glancing in the rearview mirror. And there, at the edge of the forest, I saw something. It was hard to make out in the darkness, but it looked like a figure, standing perfectly still, just watching me. My throat went dry and my hands trembled on the steering wheel. I didn't wait to find out more. I slammed on the gas and sped away. I drove for almost an hour without stopping, just trying to put as much distance as possible between me and that place. With every mile, the weight on my chest lightened, but the questions in my head only grew. Who was Rick? How did he know so much about me? And why did he show up that night? I couldn't sleep when I finally got home. I spent the rest of the night sitting on my couch, with every light in the house on, waiting for the sun to rise. I tried telling a few friends about what happened later, but most of them just laughed it off. Probably just a weirdo, they said. But it didn't feel like that. To this day, I've never gone camping alone again. Sometimes I wonder if Rick was even human, or if something else had taken his form to get close to me. Whatever it was, I hope I never find out. The most unsettling part of it all is the feeling that, somewhere out there, he's still watching me. And every time I'm alone and hear a creak or a noise out of place, his voice echoes in my head. I know you're in there. I've been working as a rideshare delivery driver for about 2 years now. It's not the most glamorous job, but it pays the bills. Most nights are uneventful. Pick up some orders, drop them off, collect a tip, and move on. Nothing too exciting. At that time, I was saving up to upgrade my car, so I'd taken a Friday night shift. It's usually busier, more orders, more money. It was around 10:30 p.m. when I got a notification to pick up an order from a fast food joint. I picked up the order quickly and checked the delivery address. It was in a more remote area, which immediately made me uneasy. It wasn't unusual to get deliveries to isolated places, but they always gave me a strange vibe. Something about this address seemed off. I can't explain it, but it felt like I should decline. Still, I needed the money. I punched the address into my GPS and started driving. The main road quickly faded behind me, and the phone signal began to flicker. It was a semi-rural area with few houses, large properties, and lots of trees around. After about 15 minutes on a narrow, winding road, I arrived at the destination. The house was old, made of wood, with faded paint. It had this abandoned look, you know? One of those places you see in horror movies and think, I'd never live here. The porch light was on, but it flickered as if the power was on its last legs. The place felt deserted. The instructions said to leave the order at the door, but something made me hesitate. I sat in the car for a few seconds, trying to convince myself it was just another delivery. I decided to get it over with. I grabbed the order, got out of the car, and walked toward the front door. Every step felt like the ground was creaking, even though I was outside. When I got closer, I noticed the lights inside the house were flickering too. That's when I started feeling like something wasn't right. The sensation of being watched was almost suffocating. I knocked lightly on the door just to be sure, but no one answered. I was about to leave the order on the porch and head back to my car when I heard footsteps inside the house. Before I could decide whether to wait or just leave, the footsteps stopped. Everything went silent. Too silent. I pulled out my phone to send a message through the app, letting the customer know I'd arrived, but the signal was gone. No 4G, no Wi-Fi, nothing. That's when I noticed something else I'd missed earlier. One of the curtains in the front window was swaying, like someone had just let go of it. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but the night was completely still. No breeze, no movement. That realization sent a chill down my spine. I decided to just finish and get out of there. I placed the bag on the ground and started walking back to my car. That's when I heard the door creak open. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make me stop in my tracks. I turned back to see the door slightly ajar. Inside, the lights kept flickering, briefly illuminating what looked like an old, dusty living room filled with antique furniture. Just leave and go, I thought. But something held me there. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the fear of getting a complaint for not doing my job properly. Before I could act, a figure appeared in the doorway. I couldn't make out much, but it was definitely a person. Tall, wearing loose clothing, almost entirely hidden in shadow. I could only see their silhouette. "You're in the wrong place," the voice said, low but firm. There was a tone that mixed accusation with a strange desperation. My instinct was to apologize, but no words came out. The air felt heavy. My heart was racing. "You shouldn't be here," the person repeated, stepping closer. I instinctively stepped back, but tripped on the edge of the porch, nearly falling. "I'm just delivering the order," I stammered, holding up the bag to show them. The silence that followed was worse than any response I could have imagined. The figure just stood there, staring. Or at least it seemed like they were. I couldn't see a face. The only thing running through my mind was, this isn't right. My brain was already scrambling to figure out the fastest way to get out of there. Without saying another word, the figure took a few more steps out of the house. Now I could see a little more clearly. The person, or whatever it was, looked unnaturally thin, with arms that seemed too long for their body. The porch light was flickering faster and faster, almost as if it was reacting to their presence. That's when I noticed something even stranger. The order I had placed on the ground was no longer there. I glanced around, but there was no sign of it. "Leave now," the voice whispered, but this time it sounded like it was coming from several directions at once. It wasn't natural. It was as if the night itself was speaking to me. I turned and ran toward my car, trying to ignore the sound of footsteps crunching the leaves behind me. When I reached the car, I unlocked the door so fast that I dropped my keys on the ground. I bent down to grab them, and when I stood back up, I saw my reflection in the car window. But it wasn't just my reflection. There was something behind me. A pale, elongated face, so close it looked like it was about to touch me. I screamed and jumped into the car, locking the doors without even thinking. I started the engine, but it stalled on the first try. Panic surged through me. I looked in the rear-view mirror but saw nothing. Still, I knew I wasn't alone. The car started on the second attempt, and I floored it, swerving through the winding road like my life depended on it, because it probably did. The feeling of being watched never left me, not for a second. I don't even know how I made it out of that road without crashing. When I finally reached the city, I pulled into a gas station, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn off the ignition. That was when I realized I was crying. After sitting there for a few minutes, trying to calm myself down, I grabbed my phone to report the incident on the app. That's when the bizarre part happened. The delivery was gone from my history. There was no record of me accepting that order or even driving to that address. It was like it had never happened. That scared me more than anything else. How was that possible? I tried to recall the customer's name, but it was like my memory was erasing itself. I couldn't remember anything about it. I stayed awake the rest of the night trying to make sense of what had happened. The next day, I don't know where I got the courage, but I decided to drive back to the location during daylight. I needed to understand. What I found sent chills down my spine. Where the house had been, there was only an empty lot, overgrown with weeds and surrounded by dead trees. No sign of the old wooden house, or any indication that anyone had ever lived there. I stopped at a nearby store and asked the clerk if they knew anything about the area. They gave me a strange look. That house was torn down about 10 years ago, they said, as if they couldn't believe I didn't know that. To this day, I have no idea what happened that night. I'm too afraid to dig deeper for answers. I quit working as a delivery driver at night and avoid driving to remote areas altogether. But I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, feeling like someone is watching me. I don't know if it was my mind playing tricks on me or something beyond explanation. But one thing is certain. I'll never forget the face I saw in that window. And every time I see flickering lights, my heart skips a beat. I've never been the same. I never thought something as simple as a romantic weekend could turn into the biggest nightmare of my life. It was 2019, early fall, and my girlfriend Emma and I decided to rent a secluded cabin to escape the chaos of the city. The idea was to spend a few days surrounded by nature, away from the noise, notifications, and our busy routines. I had just wrapped up a stressful work project, and Emma was in her final semester of college, so we really needed this time together. We found the perfect cabin on a vacation rental site. Charming, rustic, and surrounded by trees that looked like they belonged in a horror movie, though at the time it felt more like peace. The host, named Michael, was super friendly in his messages. He replied quickly, sent extra photos of the cabin, and even suggested a few hiking trails in the area. He described the place as a couple's retreat, and assured us it was safe and private. We arrived on Friday afternoon. The cabin was even prettier than in the pictures. A porch overlooking a small clearing, antique furniture that seemed to tell stories, and the smell of wood that reminded me of my grandmother's house. Everything seemed perfect, except for one detail. Michael didn't show up to greet us, even though he had promised to. He texted saying he left the key under the doormat because he got caught up in a last-minute commitment. We went inside and started settling in. Emma was thrilled by the charm of the place, but I couldn't shake a strange feeling. I don't know how to explain it. It was like I was being watched. I blamed it on exhaustion and tried to ignore it. That evening, we made a simple dinner and opened a bottle of wine. Between laughs and stories, Emma noticed something odd about the ceiling light above the dining table. There was a tiny glint, like something was hidden up there. I climbed onto a chair to check, and felt a chill run down my spine when I saw it was a camera. Small, discreet, but aimed directly at us. For a few seconds I was frozen, and Emma kept asking what I'd found. When I told her, she went pale. The first thing we did was search for other cameras. We found two more, one in the living room, pointed at the couch, and another in the bedroom, directed at the bed. It was like the air in the room got heavier. Emma started saying she wanted to leave immediately, but I insisted we should contact Michael first. I grabbed my phone and sent him a message, demanding an explanation. He replied almost immediately, saying he didn't know what we were talking about and asked us to call him. While we waited for his call, the silence inside the cabin was deafening. Every sound, the creak of the wooden floor, the wind rustling through the trees outside, made me jump. Michael finally answered, but his voice sounded different from the friendly tone he had used in the messages. He sounded confused, even irritated, as if our complaint was a personal attack. "Cameras? What cameras?" he said, in a tone that didn't convey surprise or genuine concern. I explained in detail where we found each one, but instead of offering help, he just said something vague like, "That's impossible. No one else has access to the cabin." I hung up with a terrible feeling in my gut. Emma, who was already halfway packed, insisted we should leave, but I was torn. Part of me wanted to confront Michael in person, even though I had no idea where he was. I grabbed my laptop to try accessing the cameras through the cabin's Wi-Fi. Maybe it was paranoia, but I needed to know who had put them there. While I was fiddling with the laptop, Emma found an envelope stuffed in a drawer in the living room. It was a rental contract, but the name on it wasn't Michael. It was signed by someone named Andrew. My mind started piecing things together. If Andrew was the real owner, then who was Michael? I opened the listing on the rental site, and the first thing I noticed was that the profile photo didn't match the voice we heard on the phone. It was a younger man in a suit with a professional smile. Meanwhile, Emma found a torn business card under the bed. It had a phone number and the name Andrew on it. We decided to call him. The phone rang a few times before someone picked up. A tired, almost muffled voice answered. "Who is this?" I explained who we were and why we were calling. On the other end, there was a long pause before he finally said, "That cabin shouldn't be listed. I took it down months ago." My head was spinning. I told him about Michael, the cameras, and he went silent again before muttering something that sent a chill down my spine. "You need to leave now. It's not safe." After hanging up, I stood frozen for a few seconds, trying to process what I had just heard. Emma was frantically packing the rest of our things, but everything felt surreal. Not safe? What did he mean by that? I grabbed my phone to try calling Andrew back, but the call wouldn't go through. The cell signal, already weak since we arrived, was now completely gone. "We need to get out of here now," Emma repeated, almost panicking. But something inside me needed to understand what was happening before we just ran. While Emma finished zipping up her backpack, I stepped onto the porch to see if I could get a signal. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before: fresh tire tracks on the dirt path leading up to the cabin. They weren't from our car, as the tracks were heading in the opposite direction. I couldn't see anyone, but the idea that someone might be nearby, possibly watching us, made me rush back inside. I locked the door and looked around for something I could use as a weapon. I grabbed the fire poker while Emma tried calling the police, but the cabin's landline only gave a dead tone. Then we heard a noise coming from the side of the house, like footsteps crunching on dry leaves. Emma started crying softly, trying not to make a sound, and I gestured for her to hide. I turned off all the lights and waited, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until someone knocked on the door, 3 times. It wasn't a loud knock, but controlled, almost calm. My heart felt like it was going to explode. "Who's there?" I asked, trying to sound firm, but my voice shook. There was no answer, just 3 more knocks. The courage I was trying to hold on to started to dissolve. Emma was crouched behind the couch, sobbing, and all I could think about was how to get us out of there. I opened the back door of the cabin, which led to a dark trail, and motioned for Emma to follow me. She hesitated but eventually came along. The only light came from my phone's flashlight, and every step felt louder than it should have. When we finally reached the car, I froze in place. The tires were flat, deliberately deflated. I turned to Emma, but before I could say anything, she pointed behind me with a look of pure terror. I turned slowly, still gripping the fire poker, but my mind was racing. There was no one there, at least no one I could see. What had Emma seen? She just shook her head, trying to speak, but no words came out. I looked at where she was pointing and saw something that made my breath catch. A small red light blinking at the edge of the forest. It looked just like the cameras we'd found inside the cabin. My blood ran cold. That wasn't there when we arrived. Who had put it there? And worse, who was watching us? Emma started tugging at my shirt, begging me to go back to the cabin, but I knew we couldn't stay there. I grabbed her hand, and we started running down the dark trail. Every step felt like a struggle, with roots and rocks scattered across the path. My phone's flashlight barely helped, but it was the only thing keeping us from complete darkness. The sound of our footsteps was joined by another, a faint crack of branches behind us. It wasn't constant, but it was enough to make me pick up the pace. Whoever it was, they were following us. After what felt like an eternity, we finally reached a narrow road. My plan was to flag down the first car that passed, but it was late at night, and the road was deserted. Emma started dialing the police while I kept the flashlight pointed at the trail, terrified that something, or someone, might emerge at any moment. Thankfully, the call went through, and Emma quickly explained where we were. The dispatcher said they'd send a patrol, but it would take at least 30 minutes. We had no choice but to wait by the roadside, shivering in the cold, with the constant feeling of being watched. When the police finally arrived, we told them everything. About the cameras, the messages from Michael, and Andrew's warning. The officers went into the cabin, but they didn't find anyone. The strange part, when they came back, they said there were no signs of cameras either. It was like they had never existed. I showed them the photos I had taken with my phone, but they just took notes and said they'd investigate. We never heard back about the case, and to this day, I have no idea who Michael was or what he wanted. But one thing is certain, I'll never rent a secluded place like that again. I've always been a practical person. I work as an IT analyst, and back then, my job took up most of my time. I lived alone in a house I rented in a quiet neighborhood, a place everyone said was perfect if you're looking for peace. That's exactly what I wanted. After spending my days solving complex problems at work, the last thing I needed was noise or chaos at home. This story happened in the fall of 2018. I remember it well because it was that time of year when the leaves start falling, and the air feels damp, carrying a strange sense of nostalgia. That week, it all started with something small, almost insignificant. Noises coming from the ceiling. It sounded muffled, like scratching or dragging. At first I didn't think much of it. I assumed it was squirrels or maybe even a bird that had found its way inside. It's an old house, you know. These things happen. But the noises became more frequent, not just at night, but during the day too. I started to feel a little annoyed, but convinced myself it was nothing serious. By the third sleepless night, I decided to go up to the attic and check it out. When I opened the attic hatch, I was greeted by a strange smell, a mix of mold and something stronger, maybe sweat. At the time, I didn't associate it with anything unusual. I grabbed a flashlight, climbed up, and started looking around. I didn't see anything odd, just what you'd expect. Old boxes, a dusty bike left by the previous tenant, some cobwebs. Nothing to explain the noises or the smell. Frustrated, I closed the hatch and convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the smell was just the dampness in the insulation from the weather. 2 days later, something bizarre happened. I was on the couch watching a movie, almost dozing off, when I heard a noise coming from the kitchen. It was the sound of something hitting the floor. When I went to check, I saw a loaf of bread I had left on the counter lying on the floor. No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, something felt off. I couldn't remember leaving the bread so close to the edge. My heart raced, but I forced myself to believe it was just the way I had placed it. With a nervous laugh, I picked up the bread, went back to the couch, and tried to focus on the movie. After that night, things started getting stranger. The next day, when I got back from work, the air inside the house felt different. It was as if someone had been there. The smell in the hallway leading to the attic was stronger, and something felt off in the living room, though I couldn't pinpoint what. When I got to the kitchen, I noticed a few things out of place. A mug I was sure I'd left in the dish rack was now in the sink, and one of the cabinets was slightly open. That's when I really started to feel uneasy. My first thought was that someone had broken in. I rushed to check all the windows and doors, but everything seemed locked. That night, I barely got any sleep. I lay in bed, listening to every creak in the house, as if it were a warning that something was wrong. Around 2 a.m., I heard the clearest and most unsettling sound so far: footsteps. Yes, footsteps coming from the attic. My whole body froze. It was a steady rhythm, like someone walking slowly, trying not to make too much noise. But in the dead silence of the night, it was deafening. I grabbed my phone and thought about calling the police, but hesitated. I didn't want to seem paranoid. After all, what if it was just a big raccoon or something like that? The next day, I decided to get to the bottom of it once and for all. I took the day off work and resolved to thoroughly search the attic. This time I went in more prepared. I brought a kitchen knife with me, just in case I came across an aggressive animal. When I opened the attic hatch, the strong smell almost made me turn back. I climbed up carefully, and when I pointed my flashlight to the farthest corner, my heart nearly stopped. There was an old blanket, a bag full of food wrappers, and a plastic bottle that definitely hadn't been there before. This wasn't an animal. Someone had been living up there. I scrambled down the ladder so fast I almost fell. I slammed the hatch shut and pushed a heavy piece of furniture against it, as if that would protect me. At that moment, panic completely took over. I called the police, my voice trembling as I explained the situation. They arrived about 20 minutes later, but they seemed more skeptical than I'd hoped. 2 officers went up to the attic while I waited downstairs, practically chewing my nails. A few minutes later, they came down with serious expressions. They confirmed that someone had been living there, but the person was no longer in the attic. The officers asked me a bunch of questions about whether I had noticed anything unusual in the past few days. When I mentioned the bread in the kitchen and the items out of place, they agreed it was likely the intruder. Their theory was that the person had been using an entrance in the attic connected to the garage, which hadn't been properly secured. When we checked, we found the small door leading to the attic from outside had a broken latch, making it easy for someone to get in and out without me noticing. Just thinking about someone potentially watching me while I slept or relaxed in the living room sent shivers down my spine. The officers said they'd patrol the area, but they figured the person had fled once they realized I was catching on. That was somewhat comforting, but it still left me deeply unsettled. That night was the worst of all. Even though I knew there was no one in the attic, I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. Every little noise felt louder, more sinister. The thought of someone having access to my personal space, my sanctuary, without me realizing it for days, was profoundly disturbing. The next morning, I hired a security company to reinforce every entrance to the house. I replaced the locks, installed cameras, and had the attic hatch secured with extra bolts. Even so, the sense of violation didn't go away. For days, every corner of the house felt strange, almost as if it still carried the presence of that person. I found myself constantly checking the cameras on my phone, looking for any sign of movement. A few weeks later, the feeling began to fade. But I still couldn't stop wondering who that person was. Why had they chosen my house? Was it just someone desperate for shelter? Or was there something more sinister behind it? I never found out. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever feel completely safe in that house again. Maybe it's just paranoia, but since then, I always think twice before going up into the attic of any house. One thing, though, still haunts me to this day. A few weeks after the incident, while cleaning the garage, I found something the police must have missed, or simply didn't mention. It was a crumpled piece of paper stuffed under an old toolbox. It was a handwritten note, the writing shaky and almost childlike. It read, "Thanks for letting me stay. I'm gone now, but maybe I'll come back someday." My blood ran cold. I didn't know if it was a threat or a sincere thank you. But the fact that the person had left something behind meant they'd had enough time to go through my things without me realizing it. Since then, I've never been able to fully relax at home. Every creak or shadow out of place sends my mind spiraling back to that note. It's hard to explain, but I still feel like I'm being watched, even though I know it's unlikely. I've thought about moving more than once, but I always put it off, convincing myself I'm overreacting. Maybe the scariest part of all is what we create in our own minds after something like this happens. I still tell this story to friends and family, and their reactions vary. Some laugh it off, saying it could have been much worse. Others get just as creeped out as I was back then. But one thing is certain. The feeling of having my space invaded in such an intimate way has never truly left me. These days, I try to go on with life as usual, but that note is still tucked away in a drawer. I'm not sure why I've kept it. Maybe I need proof that this really happened, that it wasn't just in my head. If there's one thing I've learned from this experience, it's that you can never blindly trust the apparent tranquility of a place. No matter how safe it seems, you never know what, or who, might be lurking, waiting for the right moment to slip into your life. I've been driving for a rideshare app for about 2 years now, but back then, I was already feeling burned out. Driving around small towns and rural areas had its perks. Less traffic, less chaos. But it also got pretty lonely. This happened on a September night, just a normal shift for me. I had just grabbed a coffee at a roadside diner and was about to wrap things up when a ride request came through. The pickup location was in the middle of nowhere. Not unusual, though. Lots of people here live on farms or remote properties. Without thinking twice, I accepted the ride. The pickup spot was down a dirt road, full of twists and turns, surrounded by trees that seemed to close in on the path. There was barely any light except for my car's headlights. When I got to the pin, I waited for a few minutes, but no one showed up. Normally, I would have canceled, but something about the place felt heavy. About 5 minutes later, a figure appeared from the trees. It was a man, tall, wearing an old brown jacket and a worn-out baseball cap, holding a small battered suitcase that looked way too heavy for its size. As soon as he got into the car, there was this strong smell, something I couldn't quite place. It was like a mix of damp earth and iron. It wasn't exactly foul, but it was unsettling. He greeted me with a soft, "Good evening," and asked me to take a route that, according to him, was quicker. The problem was, it didn't match the GPS. I pushed back a little, saying the app already optimized the route, but he just repeated, more firmly this time, "Take this way. Trust me." The unease hit me immediately. I don't usually argue with passengers. Bad ratings aren't worth it. But something about him felt off. He clung tightly to that suitcase, holding it like it would fall apart if he let go. I tried making small talk to ease the tension. I asked where he was from, what he was doing out there, but his answers were vague. Around? Working? Just passing through. Every response felt rehearsed, void of any details, like he wanted the conversation to end as quickly as possible. As I drove along the roads he directed, I started to notice my phone had no signal. That wasn't uncommon in rural areas, but in this situation, it made me even more uneasy. The roads were so narrow 2 cars could barely pass side by side. The surroundings grew increasingly isolated, Massive trees blocked out the moonlight, and the only sound was the hum of my engine. I tried turning on the radio to break the tension, but the passenger asked me to turn it off. "I need silence," he said, in a tone that felt more like a command than a request. With every mile, my mind began to spin with theories. Who was this guy? What was in the suitcase? Why was he taking such an empty, remote route? I kept trying to convince myself it was just paranoia. After all, I'd picked up strange passengers before, but nothing bad ever happened. Still, the way he stared out the window, saying nothing, made my stomach churn. He seemed too alert, like he was looking for something out there. I can't explain it, but his presence was suffocating, like the air in the car had gotten heavier. Then he made a request that genuinely freaked me out. "Turn off the headlights," he said suddenly. My reaction was instant. "What? Are you kidding me?" He didn't laugh, didn't explain. He just repeated, "Turn off the headlights just for a few seconds." I tried arguing that it was too dangerous, that I couldn't see anything in that darkness, but he kept staring at me through the rear-view mirror, his eyes gleaming oddly in the faint light. Against all logic, I did what he asked. I don't know why. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the pressure of his gaze. But for about 10 seconds, I drove in complete darkness. It was in that brief moment of blackness that I heard it. It wasn't the sound of the engine or the tires on the dirt. It was something else. A noise coming from outside the car, like something running alongside us. My heart raced, and I immediately flicked the headlights back on. I didn't see anything, but the passenger seemed satisfied. "It's fine now. You can keep going," he said calmly, as if nothing had happened. I wanted to ask what that was, but I couldn't. My voice wouldn't come out. I just kept driving, praying that this nightmare would end soon. After that, I was even more on edge. My hands were slick on the steering wheel, and my heart felt like it was about to leap out of my chest. The passenger, on the other hand, seemed completely calm. He kept staring out the window, muttering something under his breath that I couldn't make out, like he was talking to himself. I decided to break the silence and asked how much farther we had to go. He didn't answer right away. After a long pause, he finally said, "We're close. Just a few more minutes." But something in his tone told me otherwise. As we went on, I noticed the roads were getting even stranger. The dirt path looked less traveled, with potholes and branches scattered all over. Suddenly, he told me to turn right. There was no sign, just a narrow trail almost hidden by trees. I hesitated, saying my car wasn't built for that kind of terrain, but he insisted, "Go ahead, this is the way." I didn't want to. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around and leave, but the way he looked at me made my blood run cold. It was an empty stare, like he knew something I didn't. I turned onto the trail, even though it went against all common sense. Every yard felt like a battle. Branches scraped the car. The wheels jolted over uneven ground, and the feeling of being watched kept growing stronger. The passenger held tightly to his suitcase, muttering louder now, but I still couldn't understand him. Then, something darted across the road. It looked like a person, but it moved too fast to be sure. I slammed the brakes, and the car skidded slightly. My breath caught in my throat. The passenger didn't even flinch. "Just keep going," he said, in a calm voice that sent shivers down my spine. We finally reached a clearing. According to him, this was the final stop. The place was simply wrong. There was a small wooden shack, old and falling apart, with broken doors and windows. He told me to stay in the car but didn't open the door right away. "Wait here. Don't get out," he said, gripping the suitcase tightly in his hands. I nodded, frozen with fear. He got out, walked toward the shack, and disappeared inside. I stayed there, alone in the car, engine still running, staring into the surrounding darkness. But before I could decide what to do, I heard a scream coming from the shack, a sound that still echoes in my mind to this day. The scream was so loud and desperate that my hands shook on the wheel. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to drive away, but another part kept asking, what if he's in danger? It felt like my mind was split between fear and some weird sense of responsibility. I decided to wait a little longer but kept the engine running, ready to bolt at any moment. Then I heard footsteps coming from the shack. They weren't rushed, but there was something heavy about them, like something big was walking slowly. When the shack door opened, I saw the passenger stepping out. He was alone, but different. I can't explain it well, but it looked like he was taller, or maybe his shoulders had widened. He walked slowly, carrying the suitcase in one hand, but it wasn't the same suitcase as before. Now it was stained with something dark, dripping down the sides. He walked back to the car without saying a word, opened the back door, and got in. The atmosphere changed immediately. I swear the strange smell was even stronger now, almost unbearable. I asked, my voice trembling, if he was okay. He just replied, "It's taken care of." That was the only thing he said for the rest of the ride. He asked me to go back the same way, but he didn't say another word, even when I tried to make small talk. All he did was hold on to the suitcase and stare out the window like he was watching for something. When we got to the final destination, another deserted spot, he got out of the car without a word. He left a generous tip on the seat and vanished into the darkness. I sat there for a while trying to process what had just happened. On the drive back, my mind kept spinning. Who was that man? What was in the suitcase? And most importantly, what happened inside that shack? I've never told anyone about this before because I still don't know what to make of it. All I know is, after that night I stopped accepting rides in rural areas. Something changed in me, a feeling that, no matter how much we think we know the world, there are things out there we're better off leaving alone. I remember that night like it was yesterday. It was a Saturday, and I had just gotten back from a party that, honestly, wasn't even that good. I lived with 2 college roommates in an old but charming house on a quiet street near campus. Back then, I was juggling an internship during the day and night classes, so going out was rare. That day, I was already exhausted, and even with a few beers in me, all I wanted was to get home, kick off my shoes, and sleep. When I walked in around 2 in the morning, I smelled that familiar scent of the house, kind of stale but mixed with the lavender spray that Emily insisted on spritzing all over the couch. As soon as I shut the door, I noticed something strange. Lying on the couch, one of those old green velvet ones, was a man. He was sprawled on his side, with one arm hanging off the edge, like he was completely knocked out. The faint streetlight illuminated part of the room, enough for me to see him clearly. He was wearing a gray hoodie and jeans, looking completely ordinary. My first reaction was surprise, but I quickly thought, oh, he must be a friend of Emily's or Sarah's. They often brought people over after parties and sometimes forgot to mention it. He seemed so deeply asleep that I decided not to bother him. I just sighed, went to my room, and brushed it off as a little weird, but nothing too concerning. The next morning, around 9, I heard footsteps in the kitchen and figured it was one of them, or maybe even the guy on the couch. I walked out, still half asleep, and casually mentioned to Emily, who was making coffee, "So, who's the friend you guys brought home last night? He's still on the couch." She gave me a weird look, frowning. "Friend? What friend? We didn't bring anyone over." My heart started racing a little, but I stayed calm. "The guy on the couch, he's still there." "Hi." She shook her head, confused. "I didn't bring anyone." I turned and walked back to the living room, my pulse quickening. The couch was empty. No sign of the guy. The cushions weren't even out of place, no lingering smell, nothing. I froze for a moment, the adrenaline kicking in, trying to piece it all together. I glanced at the front door, which was locked, just as I had left it when I got home. I called for Sarah, who stumbled out of her room, still groggy, and asked if she knew anything. She just looked at me like I was crazy. I didn't bring anyone over, and I didn't open the door for anyone. That's when it hit me. If he wasn't a friend of theirs, and the door was locked, how did he get in? And more importantly, how did he leave? I went back to the living room trying to make sense of what had happened. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at the couch as if it could somehow give me answers. Emily and Sarah followed me, and I could see that they were starting to feel uneasy too. Emily was the first to break the silence. "Are you sure you weren't drunk or dreaming? Maybe you imagined it." But I knew what I had seen. I wasn't drunk, and I wasn't that tired either. I described the guy in detail, the hoodie, the jeans, the way he was lying, and their expressions changed. In that moment, they realized I wasn't making it up. We started going over everything. We checked all the windows, the locks, the back door. Everything was closed. Nothing had been forced. The weirdest part was that the spare key we kept hanging on a hook near the entrance was still there. There was no sign of how anyone could have gotten in or out. That uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach kept growing. "What if he's still here?" Sarah whispered, almost inaudibly. That question sent chills down my spine. We grabbed whatever we could and started checking the house room by room. Closets, under the beds, even the old dusty basement we never used. There was nothing. For a moment I thought I might be losing my mind, but the image of the man on the couch was too vivid to be my imagination. I could feel my breathing getting heavier as I tried to convince myself that there had to be a logical explanation. Sarah suggested calling the police, but Emily thought it was overkill. What if it was just someone who got in by mistake? Maybe he was lost. But how did that explain the locked doors, or the fact that no one else knew who he was? As much as I hated to admit it, the possibility that he might still be lurking somewhere in the house wouldn't leave my mind. I decided I needed to get out for the day, just to avoid being alone there. Later, while I was at the grocery store trying to calm down, I got a message from Emily. "You locked the door before you left, right?" Of course I had. But just the fact that she was asking made my stomach drop. I replied yes, and asked why. The response took a few minutes, but when it came, I froze in the middle of the aisle. "We found footprints in the hallway. Someone's been walking through the house since you left." I rushed back home, but every step felt like an eternity. My mind was racing, running through every possible explanation. When I arrived, Emily and Sarah were sitting on the living room floor, staring at the ground. They had cleaned the house the day before, so the footprints stood out clearly, small but unmistakable, leading from the living room to the hallway and disappearing near the guest room. The strangest part? They were barefoot. "Do you think he stayed hidden somewhere and only came out after you left?" I asked, trying to sound calmer than I felt. Neither of them answered. The tension in the house was suffocating, as if the air itself had gotten heavier. This time we decided to call the police. When the officers arrived, we explained everything. Of course, we got the classic skeptical looks, as if we were exaggerating. One of them suggested it might have been a drunk friend we forgot about, or a homeless person who had somehow gotten in. We insisted that the doors were locked and no one knew who the guy was. The officers did a quick sweep of the house, checked the windows and doors, and, as expected, found nothing. In the end, they told us to change the locks and said they'd keep an eye on the neighborhood, but it was obvious they didn't take us seriously. If anything, their visit made us feel even more unsettled. That night, none of us wanted to sleep alone. We dragged our mattresses into the living room and stayed there with all the lights on. The silence made every creak of the house sound louder. The groan of the floorboards, the wind rattling the windows, even the sound of our own breathing. Suddenly, Emily broke the silence. "Did you notice how comfortable he looked on the couch? Like he wasn't nervous, like someone breaking in. He looked relaxed." Her words hit me like a punch in the gut. She was right. The guy didn't have the demeanor of someone who was there by mistake. It was like he knew he could be there, like he belonged. It was almost 4 in the morning when we heard the sound that made our hearts stop. A faint scratching noise coming from the basement door. For a moment no one moved. We just exchanged terrified glances, frozen in place. "It's probably just the wind," I whispered, not believing it for a second. Emily, braver, or maybe just more reckless, grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight. "We have to check it out," she said, standing up slowly. The sound continued, soft but persistent, like fingernails dragging against wood. We followed Emily hesitantly, her phone flashlight trembling in her hand as we descended the stairs to the basement. That place was creepy enough on its own. A damp, musty space filled with old boxes left behind by previous tenants. When we reached the bottom of the stairs, the sound had stopped. We stood there in silence for a few seconds, waiting to hear anything, but the basement was completely quiet. So quiet, in fact, that we could hear our own ragged breathing. "Maybe it was a rat," I suggested, more to comfort myself than because I believed it. Emily started shining the light around, illuminating every corner of the room, but nothing seemed out of place. We were about to head back upstairs when Sarah pointed at something on the floor. "Look at this." In the far corner, near one of the small basement windows, there was a mark, a trail, as if something had been dragged through the dust. Emily aimed her flashlight closer, and that's when we saw it. The outline of a hand, large and distinct, as if someone had pressed it against the floor to push themselves up. The scariest part? The window nearby, though locked from the inside, was slightly open, just enough for someone thin to squeeze through. My stomach dropped. Whoever it was, they had been down here, while we were in the house. After that, the rest of the night was a blur. We ran back upstairs, locked the basement door, and shoved anything we could find in front of it. Chairs, boxes, whatever we could grab. None of us slept. Every little noise felt like a threat, every shadow a potential intruder. When the sun finally came up, we started making plans. We called a locksmith to replace all the locks and even added extra padlocks to the basement windows. Emily suggested installing cameras, but money was tight, so we settled for basic security. As much as we tried to move on, the feeling that something was off never left us. Every creak of the floorboards or gust of wind sent us on edge. A week later, the nightmare reached its final twist. I was home alone. Emily and Sarah were out dealing with school stuff, and decided to organize some boxes in my room. As I was going through the clutter of old papers and random junk, I found something that didn't belong to me. A small black notebook with a worn cover like it had passed through many hands. I opened it, and the first few pages were just meaningless scribbles. But as I flipped through, the content grew more disturbing. Random notes, descriptions of places I recognized, even a list of names. Our names. My stomach twisted into knots. The last page had something written that I'll never forget. "They still don't know I'm here." My name is Daniel, and I live in a simple house in a quiet neighborhood. I've always been a reserved person, the type who waves at neighbors but doesn't get too involved in their lives. This happened last year, in March, during one of those unbearably hot nights. I had just returned from a work trip and was still getting back into my routine. At the time, my neighbor, Mark, was someone I barely spoke to, but he seemed like a decent guy. He was in his early 50s, lived alone since his wife left him a few years back, and kept to himself most of the time. That night, I was in my living room with all the windows open, hoping for a breeze, when I heard something strange coming from Mark's house. It sounded like he was moving furniture, but with an intensity that made it seem like he was tearing the place apart. I checked the clock. It was almost midnight. I thought it was odd, but figured maybe he was just rearranging things. People who live alone can develop some strange habits, you know. But the noise didn't stop. It was the sound of chairs, tables, even something heavy like a couch being dragged across the floor. In the stillness of the night, it became impossible to ignore. After about 40 minutes, the noises got even more frantic. I picked up my phone, debating whether to text or call him to make sure everything was okay. But honestly, I didn't want to come off as nosy. So I peeked through my window that faced his house. What I saw was Mark, standing in his living room, staring intensely at a bookshelf, as if deciding what to do with it. He was wearing the same dirty clothes he used for yard work, caked with mud. And he looked completely oblivious to the fact that it was past midnight. Then, out of nowhere, he started pulling at the bookshelf with such force that books and boxes fell all over the floor. That's when I realized something was very wrong. This wasn't just someone rearranging their home. It was like he was desperate, almost frantic, as if he were searching for something or trying to cover up evidence. I thought about going over there, but the scene left me frozen. He was muttering to himself, words I couldn't make out, and the way he moved. It wasn't the Mark I knew. I stood there, watching, a chill running down my spine, until suddenly he turned off the lights in the living room, and everything went silent. The next morning I woke up with a strange feeling. I couldn't shake off the scene from the night before. What on earth was he doing? I decided to check Mark's house before heading to work. From the outside, everything seemed normal. His car was still parked in the driveway, and the curtains were drawn, as usual. But something caught my attention. His doorbell was hanging loose, like someone had yanked it off. I thought it was odd, but again, I didn't want to overthink it. Mark had always been a bit eccentric. Maybe it was just one of his quirks. The day dragged on, and when I got back home that evening, the first thing I noticed was the absolute silence coming from Mark's house. No lights on, no movement. It looked abandoned. That unsettled me because, despite being reserved, Mark was a creature of habit. He always watered his plants in the late afternoon or left the radio playing softly. This silence was unnerving. I tried to brush it off, but when I went out to take the trash, I noticed his front door was slightly ajar. That wasn't normal. I stood on the sidewalk for a while, debating whether I should go in or call someone. But once again, fear of overreacting held me back. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me, and I walked over. I knocked on the door a few times, calling out for Mark, but there was no answer. I pushed the door open slowly, and the smell hit me before I even stepped inside. It wasn't rotten, but there was something off, like damp mixed with a metallic tang, you know? The living room was a complete mess, with furniture overturned and books scattered everywhere. The bookshelf he'd been moving the night before was toppled over, but it didn't look like someone had been searching for something. It was as if everything had been abandoned mid-chaos. The strangest part was the footprints. Bare footprints, smeared with dirt, trailing from the living room to the kitchen. They looked fresh. My heart started racing. I kept calling out for Mark, but the house was eerily silent. That's when I noticed something on the wall, a fallen picture frame revealing a small deep hole behind it. I couldn't see much inside, just darkness, and what looked like mold creeping around the edges. A chill ran down my spine, and I left the house as quickly as I could. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that hole in the wall and Mark's dark, empty house next door. I kept trying to rationalize everything. Maybe he left in a hurry. Maybe he went to visit someone. Or maybe he was in the hospital. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The next day, I decided to call the police. I explained that my neighbor was missing and that his house was in a strange state. They asked me when I had last seen him. "Last night," I said without hesitation. But what the officer told me next made my legs nearly give out. "Sir, we have a missing person report for your neighbor Mark, filed by his sister 3 weeks ago. He shouldn't have been there since then." My heart started pounding. How could that be? I had seen him, heard him moving furniture just last night. I told the officer exactly that, but he just replied that a patrol car would be sent to investigate. I spent the entire day restless, pacing back and forth. When I finally heard the siren, I rushed to the window. 2 officers entered the house, and the silence after they closed the door felt endless. It took them almost an hour to come out, and both of them looked serious. One came over to talk to me, asking if I could describe what I had heard and seen the previous night. I repeated everything, from the furniture being moved to Mark, standing in front of the bookshelf. They exchanged a worried look before telling me that the house was completely empty. No furniture, no mess, nothing. It looked like no one had lived there for weeks. I tried to argue, insisting that I had seen all of it with my own eyes, but they just took notes, thanked me, and assured me they would continue investigating. After the police left, I stared at Mark's house for hours. It didn't make any sense. I saw him there. The lights were on, the furniture was in disarray. It wasn't my imagination. I decided to call the neighborhood manager, Tom, an old retiree who knew everything that happened around here. I asked him if he had seen anything unusual at Mark's house, but he just said the place had been empty ever since Mark's sister had the locks changed. The locks? But the door was open yesterday. He paused for a moment before saying something that sent a chill down my spine. Daniel, I don't know what you think you saw, but no one's touched that door since it was locked. Not even his sister has been back there. After that conversation with Tom, I felt even more uneasy. I decided I had to go back into Mark's house, even though I knew it was a terrible idea. Something in there was calling me, like I needed to understand what was happening. I waited until nightfall, when the neighborhood was completely quiet, and went through the front door, which was still unlocked, despite what Tom had said. The house felt different. There was no longer any moldy smell or dirt trails. It was as if someone had scrubbed every surface clean, but in a way that felt unnatural, you know? Like they were trying to erase every trace of anyone ever living there. I went straight to the living room and looked at the hole behind the picture frame. I pulled out my phone and shone its light into the darkness, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain all this. And I did. At the bottom of the hole, there was a folded piece of paper. I carefully pulled it out and realized it was a letter, written in shaky, almost illegible handwriting. If you found this, it means he got me. Don't trust what your eyes see. He moves when you're not looking. My heart stopped. He. Who was he? I wanted to run out of there, but something held me in place, like my feet were glued to the floor. That's when I heard it. The sound of furniture being dragged coming from upstairs. My muscles locked, and I couldn't move. It was the same sound from the other night, but now it was directly above me. I remembered the letter's warning. Don't trust what your eyes see. And even though I was terrified, I climbed the stairs, one step at a time, trying to make as little noise as possible. With each step, the sound grew louder, more frantic. When I reached the second-floor hallway, I noticed the last door on the right was slightly ajar, with a faint, flickering light coming from inside. Every instinct told me to turn back, but something stronger, curiosity, maybe madness, pushed me forward. When I opened the door, the room was empty. No furniture, no people, nothing. But in the corner of the ceiling, almost imperceptible, something was moving. It was a shadow, but it didn't make sense. It moved on its own, against the light from the flickering bulb, and then it turned toward me. I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't a face, but I knew it was looking at me. An unbearable cold shot through my body, and before I could react, the shadow lunged at me. I blacked out. When I came to, I was lying on the sidewalk in front of the house. The door was shut, and everything looked as it had before. I wanted to believe it was just a nightmare, but I was still clutching the piece of paper in my hand. Since that night, I've never gone back into that house. The police eventually sealed it off, but every time I walk by, I feel like something is watching me from the windows. Mark was never found, and to this day, I can't stop wondering who or what was in that house with me that night. I've never been the type to believe in ghost stories. Honestly, I've always been skeptical of anything supernatural. I've worked as a nurse for almost 10 years now, and I've seen it all during my shifts. Absurd accidents, emergencies that felt straight out of a movie, even patients claiming to have bizarre experiences. But none of that ever got to me. Well, until that night. It was just another Tuesday near the end of my shift, and I was counting down the minutes to go home. Little did I know that night would stick with me forever. I was in the break room packing my things, trying to ignore the constant mix of disinfectant and stale coffee lingering in the air. The hospital was quieter than usual, which is always a relief. But it also comes with an eerie feeling, like something bad is about to happen. Around 10:30 p.m., the reception phone rang. Since the receptionist had stepped out to grab water, I went to answer it. "Emergency, how can I help?" I asked, not expecting much more than a prank call or someone lost looking for directions. But what I heard on the other end froze me in place. It was a woman's voice, full of panic. "Please, there's someone in my house. He got in, and I don't know what to do." She was breathing heavily, almost sobbing. I asked the basics. Her name, address, if she was safe. She said she was locked in her bedroom but could hear footsteps in the hallway. Her words were choppy, like she was whispering to avoid being heard. My instinct was to calm her down, explain I'd call the police immediately, but before I could ask anything else, the call filled with static. "Hello, ma'am? Are you still there?" Just silence. I did the only thing I could. I wrote down the address and passed it to the police. They promised to send a unit right away. I held the phone in my hand for a few moments, replaying the desperation in that woman's voice. I'd received strange calls before, but there was something about how she spoke, the fear almost tangible, that made my heart race. It felt like I could sense something was deeply wrong on the other side of the line. A few minutes later, the receptionist came back and, seeing my expression, asked if everything was okay. I just nodded, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. I couldn't get the call out of my head, even as I tried to focus on the rest of my shift. About half an hour later, I saw one of the officers who regularly comes by the hospital walk into the reception area. Mike, the sergeant, had the typical demeanor of someone who had seen it all and didn't get rattled easily. But that night, he looked uneasy. He asked who made the 911 call and if he could talk to me. When I explained what happened, he stayed silent for a moment before finally saying, "We went to the address. The house was empty." That caught me off guard. "What do you mean empty? The woman was there, on the phone with me." He shrugged, but I could tell he was holding something back. Finally, he continued, "The front door was unlocked, but there was no one inside. No signs of a break-in or a struggle. But upstairs we found an old rotary phone, disconnected, lying on the floor in one of the bedrooms. It looked like someone had used it recently." At that moment, I laughed nervously. It felt surreal. But Mike looked at me with a seriousness that made my stomach drop. "The phone number you gave us, it belonged to someone who died years ago." My heart felt like it was about to leap out of my chest. "Are you sure? That can't be right," I asked, my voice shaking. Mike shook his head. "I double-checked. The house is known in the neighborhood. No one's lived there since the owner passed away. The neighbors say the place has been for sale for years, but no one ever buys it. And here's the weirdest part. The phone we found there belonged to the original owner. It's the same number you answered." That was impossible. I clung to logic, trying to find an explanation. Maybe someone was using the number with old technology, or maybe it was just an elaborate prank. But none of that explained the sheer terror in the woman's voice. Even so, I tried to put it behind me. I thanked Mike and went back to the break room. but my mind wouldn't stop racing. Curiosity got the better of me. During a quiet moment, I decided to dig into the address. I found out the homeowner, Edna, had passed away of natural causes, alone, in the same bedroom where the phone was found. A few news articles mentioned that neighbors reported strange things after her death. Lights turning on and off by themselves, voices coming from inside the house. I wanted to believe it was all exaggeration, but the pieces were coming together in a way I couldn't ignore. After discovering all of that, my anxiety only got worse. I went back to work, but the feeling that something was off wouldn't leave me. It was like every minute, the atmosphere around me got heavier. I remember that night being quieter than usual in the hospital, and even the hallways seemed darker. I couldn't stop myself from glancing at the reception phone every so often, half expecting it to ring again. Around midnight, it finally did. It was the same number. My heart raced, and my hand hovered over the receiver for a moment before I picked it up. "Emergency, how can I help?" On the other end, silence. But it wasn't ordinary silence. It was as if I could hear distant breathing, almost imperceptible. "Hello? Are you there?" I pressed, feeling my stomach twist. Suddenly, a barely audible voice responded, "He's still here." The call disconnected immediately after. This time, I didn't hesitate to call Sergeant Mike and tell him what had just happened. He sounded as uneasy as I felt. "We're going back there now," he said. "If something's happening, we'll find out." I wanted to believe that would bring me some relief, but deep down, I knew the night was far from over. While waiting for news, I stayed alone at the reception desk. Every little sound, the distant echo of a gurney being pushed, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, felt amplified. The phone, now silent, seemed to stare at me, like it knew something I didn't. Almost an hour later, Mike called back. His voice was graver than before. "We got there. The house is just as we left it, but we found something strange. In the same room there were footprints in the dust, but they weren't ours. They looked like they belonged to someone barefoot going back and forth to the phone." I couldn't respond immediately. Mike continued. "There was nothing else, just the footprints. But one thing caught our attention. Someone left a note by the phone. It said, 'Please help.' The tone of his voice suggested he didn't know what to think anymore, and I was in the same boat. What did it mean? Was the woman who called still in need of help? Or was it some kind of message left years ago? When I hung up, I felt torn between the need to understand and the overwhelming desire to forget the whole thing forever. After that last call, I couldn't stop staring at the reception phone, feeling a knot in my stomach. Something inside me told me this wasn't over yet. I spent the rest of the shift with my mind stuck on the words Mike had said. Please help. Should I do something? But what? As soon as my shift ended, I made a decision I never thought I would. I drove to the address. It was crazy, I know, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman who called was still waiting for help. When I got there, the street was completely deserted, lit only by a few scattered streetlights. The house was a typical old structure, with large windows and dingy curtains hanging like cobwebs. The yard looked abandoned for years, with overgrown grass and trees that resembled distorted shadows. Something pulled me toward that unlocked front door, but every step felt like carrying the weight of 1,000 bad decisions. I took a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped inside. The air inside was heavy, dense, as if time had stopped in that place. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking as if trying to betray my presence. I reached Edna's bedroom. The phone was still there, exactly where Mike had described it. And that's when it happened. The moment I stepped into the room, I felt a presence. It wasn't something I could see or hear, but an overwhelming sensation, as if something was watching my every move. The moment I approached the phone, it rang. The sound was so loud and unexpected that I nearly dropped it. I picked it up with trembling hands. "Hello? I whispered. On the other end, a voice, distant and faint as if from another world, said just one sentence. "Thank you for coming." And then everything stopped. The phone went silent, the sense of presence disappeared, and the room felt like just another empty space in an old house. I left without looking back and never returned. I can't explain what happened that night, but something tells me that, in some way, I did what that voice needed. To this day, I'm not sure if I believe in the supernatural, but one thing is certain. I'll never answer a phone the same way again. I've never been the kind of person who gets scared easily. I grew up in a small town, listening to my grandma's ghost stories, so I always thought I had a pretty skeptical mind. But what happened that night, during what should have been a routine trip, made me question a lot of things. It was 2017, and I was driving to a small town in the middle of nowhere, heading to my sister's wedding. It was past 11 p.m. when I decided to stop at a gas station to refuel and use the restroom. The road was deserted, the wind the only thing keeping me company, and the gas station itself looked run down, with a flickering light near the entrance that made me uneasy the moment I got out of the car. The attendant was a tired-looking man wearing a faded shirt, with an unlit cigarette dangling from the corner of his mouth. He gave me a half-hearted wave, like he was there out of obligation. After filling up my tank, I asked where the restroom was, and he pointed with his thumb toward a dimly lit hallway next to the convenience store. I grabbed my phone's flashlight just in case, since half the corridor lights didn't seem to work. The hallway was narrower than I expected, and the overwhelming smell of mildew made me breathe through my mouth. When I reached the restroom door, it was slightly ajar, and I could hear the faint dripping of a faucet inside. I stepped in and immediately noticed that the restroom was just as run down as the rest of the gas station. Cracked tiles, a stained mirror, and 2 stalls with rusty doors made up the scene. I picked the first stall, the one closest to the entrance, and locked the door behind me. While doing my business, I couldn't help but notice something strange. A pair of boots in the stall next to mine. They were black, worn out, with loose laces and soles caked in dirt, as if their owner had been walking for miles. It struck me as odd that someone else was there at that hour, but I didn't think much of it. I finished up, washed my hands, and left. As I got back to my car, I realized I'd forgotten my wallet. Frustrated, I grabbed my flashlight again and headed back to the restroom. When I stepped inside for the second time, something unsettling caught my attention. The same pair of boots was still there, in the exact same position as before. I froze for a moment, staring at them, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence. But something didn't feel right. Who would stay locked in a stall for that long? And why hadn't I heard any noise? No rustling, no flushing, nothing. That uneasy feeling started to grow inside me. Still, I tried to shake it off. I picked up my wallet from the sink, quickly checked to make sure nothing was missing, and got ready to leave. But before I could reach the door, something made me stop. A sound. A faint dragging noise, like someone shifting their feet in the stall next to me. I froze with my hand on the doorknob, listening closely. The sound came again, but it was too soft, almost as if it were coming from far away. It didn't make sense. The restroom was empty, except for me and those boots. Without thinking much, I took a few steps toward the other stall. I knocked lightly on the door, trying to sound casual. "You okay in there?" I asked, hoping for a reply that would dispel the growing unease. Nothing. The silence on the other side was almost suffocating. My heart began to race, and the sense that something was seriously wrong took hold of me. I took a deep breath and decided to look under the stall door, sure I'd find someone sleeping or ignoring me. When I crouched down, I saw the boots, still motionless as before. But there were no legs, no body, nothing. Panic began to set in. I stood up quickly, stumbling backward. My mind was scrambling for a logical explanation. Maybe someone had left the boots there, but how? And why? That's when I heard a sound that froze me to my core. A faint whisper, almost inaudible, coming from inside the stall. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone carried something off. It didn't sound human, or at least not like anything I'd ever heard. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a cold chill ran down my spine. There was no doubt in my mind now. I had to get out of there. As I rushed to the door, something else happened. The light started flickering erratically, and the dripping faucet grew louder, almost deafening. I tried to ignore it, but then a sharp noise echoed behind me, like the stall door being slammed open. Against my better judgment, I turned to look. The stall was empty. The boots were gone. But now, a sound was coming from the walls. A low, irregular sobbing, like a lost child's cries. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from. All I knew was that the tiny restroom felt like it was closing in on me, suffocating me. My first instinct was to run. Without thinking, without looking back, I just needed to get out of there as fast as I could. But when I reached for the doorknob, it wouldn't budge. It was like it had locked itself, even though there was no visible lock or key. I yanked at it, kicking the bottom of the door, but it wouldn't give. The sobbing, which had been faint before, now grew louder. It wasn't just a cry anymore. It was sharper, more piercing, like it was right behind me. The air in the bathroom felt heavier, thick with the metallic smell of iron that made me gag. My phone's flashlight began to flicker, just like the overhead lights. With no other options, I turned my back to the door, trying to stay calm. "If someone's here, I just want to leave," I shouted. But my voice sounded weak, like the room was swallowing the sound. The mirror, that old, grimy piece of glass that barely reflected anything, now showed something that shouldn't have been there. Behind me, in the stall I had just checked, was a shadow. It wasn't a person. It was a shapeless, looming figure, too tall to fit in the cramped space. It seemed to pulse, as though it was alive, but it was made of pure darkness, dense and oppressive. I blinked, hoping it was my mind playing tricks on me, but the thing was still there, motionless, watching. Or at least, that's what it felt like. I was gripped by a primal terror. My body wouldn't move. My legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. All I could hear was the pounding of my heart and the ragged sound of my breathing. The shadow started to shift, slowly and deliberately, as if it wanted me to see every movement. There were no footsteps, only the sound of that strange sobbing, now louder and reverberating off the walls. For a moment I thought I heard my name whispered between the sobs, which nearly broke me. At that moment, I knew that if I didn't act, I'd be stuck in that place forever. Desperate, I aimed my flashlight at the stall. The weak beam of light seemed almost useless against the darkness, but for a split second I noticed something. Scratches on the floor, right where the boots had been. Deep, jagged marks, as if something heavy had been dragged. And then the sound changed again. It was laughter now, low and guttural, coming from every direction at once. The feeling that the place was alive was undeniable. My only chance was to break down the door. I threw my shoulder into it, ignoring the pain that shot through my arm with every hit. I had to get out of there. At the time, I worked as a barista at a small cafe about 3 blocks from my apartment. This was back in 2018, during the fall. It was that time of year when daylight savings had ended, and the nights felt longer than usual. I always worked the evening shifts, so I was used to walking home in the dark. My route was almost always the same. I'd walk down a main street, cut through a small park, and take a shortcut through an alley that ran between 2 old buildings. It was the fastest way home, and I used that shortcut practically every day. The alley was narrow but well lit with yellow lights hanging along the walls. It had never scared me before. Never. That night the cafe had been pretty slow, but exhaustion weighed heavily on my shoulders. I closed out the register, grabbed my apron, and left around 11:30 p.m. The air was damp, and the streets were empty as usual. As soon as I reached the entrance of the alley, something felt off. I can't quite explain it, but it just felt wrong. The lights that usually lit the path were all shattered. Not one or two, every single one of them. The alley was plunged into complete darkness, so dark I could barely see the ground. My first instinct was to turn around and take the longer route down the main road, but that would have added at least 15 minutes to my walk, and I was exhausted. I sighed, pulled out my phone, and turned on the flashlight. It'll be quick, I told myself. You've walked through here 100 times. As I stepped into the alley, the sound of my footsteps echoed louder than usual. The silence was so oppressive that every little noise seemed amplified. The beam of my flashlight flickered across bits of trash, stained bricks, and graffiti-covered walls. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, coming from behind me. My entire body froze. I forced myself to turn around, but there was no one there. Just emptiness. My eyes scanned the length of the alley, searching for any movement, but there was nothing but darkness. My heart was pounding, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe my own footsteps had echoed weirdly, making it sound like someone else was there. I started walking again, trying to ignore the chill creeping up my spine. But then, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were louder, clearer. Every time I took a step, another followed, matching my pace. I stopped walking, hoping the sound would stop too. It didn't. A step, then another, getting closer and closer. My heart was racing so fast I could barely breathe. With a trembling hand, I spun around, shining the flashlight behind me. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure I could hear it in the silence. No matter how much I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I stood there for a few seconds, shining the flashlight in every corner of the alley, but the beam only revealed peeling walls and piles of trash. Still, that feeling wouldn't go away. It was like something was there, something I couldn't see. I took a deep breath and tried to laugh it off, though my voice came out weak and shaky. "You're just being paranoid," I muttered, more to myself than anything. I started walking faster, almost jogging, clutching my phone like it was some sort of shield. I didn't dare look back again, but the footsteps kept coming. And now they weren't following my rhythm anymore. They were uneven, like whoever, or whatever, was behind me was stumbling or dragging their feet. My stomach twisted with every sound, and I could feel the sweat dripping down the back of my neck despite the cold night air. It's close, way too close, I thought, fighting the urge to break into a full sprint. Someone once told me running only makes things worse, but at that moment, it felt like nothing would make a difference. Then everything changed. The footsteps stopped. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating, as if the very air was watching me. I don't know what was worse, hearing those footsteps or the sudden stillness that replaced them. Suddenly, everything seemed darker, as if the flashlight on my phone had dimmed. The fear was so deep in me that I could feel a lump in my throat, unable to scream or call for help. My eyes locked on the end of the alley, where the faint glow of the main street seemed miles away. I just need to get there, I thought, clinging to that hope like a lifeline. But then, out of the corner of my eye, something moved. A blur, quick and indistinct, like a shadow that shouldn't have been there. I whipped my head around, pointing the flashlight at where I thought I saw the movement. The beam landed on a pile of fallen boxes, but something was off. The air around them seemed distorted. almost like the shimmer of heat rising off asphalt on a hot day, except it was freezing. I took a step back, and that's when I heard it. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was breathing. Slow, heavy breathing that sounded almost human, but not quite. The breathing was coming from somewhere near the boxes, but no matter how hard I tried to see, the flashlight seemed useless in that moment. It was as if something was swallowing the light, turning everything around it into even deeper shadows. My whole body froze, every muscle locked in place, like any movement might draw whatever it was closer to me. "Just run!" my mind screamed, but my legs wouldn't listen. Then I heard it, a low sound, almost imperceptible, like a whisper coming from the darkness. It wasn't a word, more like a guttural noise, something that came from deep in a throat that didn't sound quite human. Finally, I managed to move. I took 2 hurried steps backward, keeping my eyes locked on that corner where the shadow seemed to breathe. The flashlight shook in my hand, and I knew if it went out, that would be the end. My mouth was dry, my breathing shallow and erratic, and the only thing I could think was, this isn't real. This can't be real. But every sound, every feeling told me otherwise. The faint glow of the streetlight at the end of the alley seemed farther away than ever, but I knew it was my only chance. Without thinking, I turned my back on whatever it was and started to run, my footsteps echoing desperately in the empty alley. As I ran, something felt different. It wasn't footsteps behind me anymore. It was a pressure, a presence that seemed to fill the space around me. It was like the air had become heavier, denser, and every breath was a struggle. I tried not to look back, but it was impossible to ignore the feeling that something was inches away from me. Something that didn't need to make noise to chase me. My eyes stayed locked on the end of the alley, where the light seemed to shine like a promise of safety. Just a few more steps, I thought, as if that would be enough to save me. When I finally stumbled out of the alley, I almost fell onto the sidewalk. The air felt different outside, lighter, as if whatever that thing was couldn't cross the boundary of that dark corridor. I turned back, still gasping for air, and what I saw sent chills down my spine. The alley was empty, completely empty. No shadows, no sounds, as if everything that had happened was a hallucination. But what scared me the most was the last street light in the alley, the one closest to the entrance. It wasn't broken like the others. It flickered, dim and erratic, like it was trying to warn me that whatever it was still there, waiting. I've never been the type to believe in supernatural stuff. Always been pretty skeptical. That annoying friend who tries to rationalize everything. This happened about 5 years ago, back when I lived in a quiet suburb just outside the city. At the time, I had just started a job as a night shift supervisor at a warehouse, which meant I was usually driving home alone at 3 or 4 in the morning. It was a Saturday, and I remember being exhausted, counting the minutes until I could get home, take a shower, and crash into bed. That night felt especially heavy, the kind of silence you only notice when you're all by yourself. I was driving down the main avenue of my neighborhood, lined with neat lawns and streetlights casting long, distorted shadows. That's when I saw her for the first time. A woman, wearing what looked like a torn dress, standing on the shoulder of the road and waving frantically. The dress was ripped in a few places, and her hair was disheveled, like she'd spent the night outdoors. At first I hesitated. That's not the kind of thing you expect to see in such a quiet area, and every instinct told me to keep driving. But as I got closer, I noticed the desperation in her movements. Her arms were shaking, and her face showed a mix of fear and urgency that made me think she really needed help. I pulled over a few feet ahead of her, leaving the engine running just in case. As she walked toward my car, I got a better look. Her dress was stained with dirt, and there were scratches on her arms. But the strangest thing was how she kept glancing behind her, toward the darkness of the street, as if expecting someone, or something, to appear. Before I could even ask what was going on, she started screaming. Not a normal scream, but something primal, like she was too terrified to form actual words. My heart started pounding, and my first reaction was to look in the same direction she was staring. But there was nothing there. Then she screamed something that made my blood run cold. "There's someone in your back seat!" I froze. Her words didn't make sense because I was certain I was alone when I got in the car. Even so, I turned around to check. The back seat was empty, or at least it looked that way. The street lights didn't help much, casting more shadows inside the car than I cared to see. Before I could say anything, the woman banged on the passenger side window so hard I nearly jumped out of my seat. "You need to get out of there! Now!" she yelled, her voice breaking like she was about to cry. Every part of me wanted to believe she was crazy, but there was something in her expression that left me paralyzed. I opened my mouth to tell her there was nothing there, but before I could, a chill ran down my spine. I don't know how to describe it, but it felt like the air inside the car had suddenly gotten heavier. For a moment I was frozen, staring at the woman outside and then at the inside of the car. My brain was scrambling to make sense of everything, but my body just wouldn't respond. The woman kept banging on the window, more frantic by the second, her words tumbling out between sobs and screams. "They always wait, always, behind the seat," she shouted, as if it made perfect sense. The strange thing is, even though I didn't understand, something deep inside me believed her. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and all I could do was grab my phone from the passenger seat and turn on the flashlight. The beam wavered as I aimed it at the back seat. Nothing. Just the worn leather and the shadows of tree branches outside. But the weight in the air didn't go away, like something unseen was watching me. The woman stepped back when she saw the flashlight. "That's what they want. Light doesn't drive them away, it only makes them angry," she shouted, and at that moment, I thought she had to be some kind of lunatic. I was 1 second away from driving off when suddenly I heard a noise. A muffled sound like something shifting slightly inside the car. My heart nearly stopped, and I whipped my head around so fast my neck cracked. The flashlight was pointed at the back seat, but this time the shadows seemed different. I can't explain it. It was like something had adjusted itself in the darkest corner, just where the light couldn't quite reach. "Don't look for too long," the woman screamed, her voice filled with such urgency that I accidentally dropped the phone onto the seat. It landed with the flashlight pointing upward, lighting up the car's ceiling. For a moment, the interior was dim again, and that's when I saw it, or thought I did. It was like an outline, a barely there silhouette, crouched in the corner of the back seat, as if it were waiting for me to look straight at it. My eyes widened, my whole body locked in place. The woman outside was sobbing now, yelling something I couldn't fully hear over the ringing in my ears. Something about not being too late if I ran. My mind was racing, trying to decide what to do. I could start the car and drive away, but that would mean turning my back on whatever might, or might not, be in the back seat. The thought of carrying it with me terrified me more than running. So I did the only thing that came to mind. I opened the driver's side door and jumped out as fast as I could, stumbling and almost falling onto the asphalt. The cold night air hit my face, but it didn't bring any relief. The woman stared at me with a mix of relief and terror, like she hadn't expected me to actually get out of the car. Now I was standing outside the car, heart pounding in my chest, staring at it like it might come alive. The woman took a few steps back, grabbing at the sleeve of my shirt. "Get away! You need to get away!" Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the strength in the way she pulled at me made it clear she knew more than she was letting on. I wanted to scream, to ask her what was going on, but all I managed was a shaky, hoarse whisper. "What is it? Is someone in there?" She didn't answer right away, just kept staring at the car like it was a wild animal about to attack. And that's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The windows, which had been clear under the streetlights, were now completely dark, as if something inside was blocking the light. She started muttering something I couldn't understand, a prayer or maybe a mantra, repeated in a frantic rush. My legs were shaking, and I felt like I might collapse at any second. I wanted to run, to get away and never look back, but the car was mine, and my practical side was screaming that abandoning it made no sense. "You can't go back," the woman finally said, her voice so final that it silenced every argument I had. "They only need a moment of distraction. That's how they get you." The way she said "they" sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't an explanation, it was a warning. Against every logical instinct, I took a step closer to the car. I needed to be sure there was no one there, that this was all just paranoia brought on by exhaustion or her desperation. I picked up my phone from the ground and turned the flashlight back on. The beam trembled as I aimed it at the back seat again, and everything looked empty, exactly as it should. I let out a sigh of relief, but it didn't last long. That's when I saw it. On the rear window in the corner, there was a mark. I don't know how to describe it, but it looked like a fingerprint, stretched and smudged, as if someone had dragged their hand across the glass from the inside. My body locked up, and a wave of panic washed over me. "They're playing with you," she whispered behind me. My body moved before my brain could process. I dropped my phone again and turned to run, but the woman grabbed my arm. "Don't look back, just run, and don't look." Her tone was pure desperation, and something in her eyes made me obey without question. I started running, the weight of fear driving me forward. I didn't look at the car, the street, or anything behind me. Every step felt like a hammer pounding the ground, and my heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst. The woman ran with me for a few yards before stopping. I don't know what happened to her. I just remember hearing her screams fade into the distance as I kept running, until I finally saw the lights of my house around the corner. When I got home, I slammed the door shut and locked every bolt, as if that could somehow protect me from something I couldn't even explain. My chest was heaving, and I just stood there, leaning against the door, trying to process what had just happened. The silence inside my house was almost deafening, but it still felt better than the suffocating air outside. After a few minutes, I gathered enough courage to peek out the living room window. The street was empty. My car was still parked where I had left it, its interior dark and lifeless. There was no sign of the woman. That silence felt wrong, like the entire street was holding its breath. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the floor of my living room with all the lights on and my phone in my hand, but I couldn't call anyone. What would I even say? "Hey, there's something in the back seat of my car and a crazy woman told me to run." I knew that if I tried to explain it, no one would believe me. Even I was starting to doubt what I had seen. But those marks on the glass, they were real. When the sun finally started to rise, I decided I had to deal with it once and for all. I grabbed a baseball bat from the closet, more for my own sense of security than anything else, and walked back to where I had left the car. The daylight gave me a little courage, but it also revealed details I wished I hadn't seen. The back window was now covered in smudges, as if dozens of hands had pressed against it during the night. My legs felt weak, and for a moment I considered just leaving the car there and never coming back. But I had to face it. I opened the driver's side door slowly, ready to confront whatever it was. The interior was empty, as it should have been, but the air still felt heavy, like something invisible was watching me. I took a deep breath, got into the car, and started the engine. As I drove home, a voice in the back of my mind kept telling me I needed to sell that car as soon as possible. In the end, that's exactly what I did. I put the car up for sale the following week and never drove alone at night again. To this day, I don't know what really happened that night. Whether it was something supernatural, an illusion caused by exhaustion, or even a trick played by that woman. But every now and then, on quiet nights like that one, I still feel that heavy weight in the air, like something waiting for the right moment to come back. I don't know what they are, and maybe it's better that way. I'd rather believe that by running that night I escaped something I was never meant to encounter. I've never really been close to my dad's side of the family, you know? When he passed away about 6 months ago, I found out that he had one of those storage unit rental contracts, like the ones you see on TV. I almost ignored the lawyer's letter because, honestly, it seemed like one of those unnecessary things he hoarded. But in the end, I decided to check it out. At the time, I was living in a small apartment in the city, sharing space with a cat named Luna and stacks of old books, so I thought maybe I'd find something interesting or valuable. It was a Friday afternoon when I headed over to the storage unit. I was off work, and to be honest, I didn't have high expectations beyond getting rid of another boring task. The place was tucked away in a forgotten part of the city, with those narrow streets designed for no one to pass through. When I arrived, the manager greeted me with a mix of indifference and curiosity. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with a faded shirt that had seen better days. He led me to the unit, which looked more like a dark metal cave. The door creaked when I opened it, sending a chill down my spine, and the smell of dust and something faintly sour hit me. My first impression was that my dad really had stored junk. Stacked boxes, a rusted bike, and even an old radio that probably stopped working in the 90s. It wasn't until I started moving some boxes that I found something that made my heart stop for a moment. It was a thick file, one of those cardboard folders, and it seemed out of place there in the middle of everything. It was sitting on top of one of the boxes, like it had been placed there recently, which was strange, considering the unit was supposedly abandoned for years. When I opened it, my stomach dropped. Inside were dozens, maybe hundreds of photos. Photos of me. Some were really old, like from high school when I used to wear that blue jacket I loved. Others were recent, taken on my apartment's balcony or while I was grocery shopping. The most disturbing part? All the photos were taken from a distance, like someone was spying on me. Some had dates scribbled on the back, and they all seemed carefully organized, as if someone had been documenting my life. I rushed out of the unit with the file in hand and went straight to the manager. He looked as confused as I was when I showed him the photos. "This can't be possible," he kept saying, rubbing his forehead as though that would help solve the mystery. According to him, the unit had been abandoned for over a decade, and the contract was only in my dad's name because no one had ever shown up to transfer it. Maybe he rented it to someone else, he suggested. But that didn't make sense. My dad barely spoke to me, let alone share a space like this with a stranger. He even showed me the records, and there it was, no entry logged for years. The key, supposedly, hadn't been used since my dad last stored his things. After that conversation with the manager, I went home with my mind racing. The folder of photos was sitting on the passenger seat, and I found myself glancing at it every time I stopped at a traffic light. Who would take so many photos of me? And why? When I got to my apartment, I locked the door twice and went straight to the living room, spreading the photos across the floor. Luna, my cat, seemed uneasy, as if she could sense my anxiety. As I looked through the images, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. In some of the photos, especially the recent ones, I could see a reflection in the glass of windows or mirrors nearby. It was a blurry face, almost indistinguishable, but it looked male, with a wide-brimmed hat. My stomach twisted. Whoever this was, they weren't even trying to hide their presence. That night was unbearable. Every sound in the building, the creaking wood, footsteps above, made me jump. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone standing outside my window watching me. The next morning, I decided I had to find out more. I went back to the storage unit, but this time, I was prepared. I brought a flashlight and a kitchen knife just to be safe. The manager gave me that look of, "Here comes this weirdo again," but didn't say anything and let me in. I searched every corner of that unit, pulling everything out into the hallway. That's when I found something else strange. A black notebook filled with scribbled notes. The handwriting was shaky, almost like the person had written in a hurry or under stress. There were no names, just fragmented phrases like, "He can't know," and "Always watch, but never get close." Some pages even had weird drawings, street maps, an X marked on certain spots, and my apartment building drawn several times. I stood frozen in the hallway, holding that notebook with trembling hands. Whoever had written this knew a lot about me, more than anyone should. When I showed it to the manager, he just shook his head, saying that it didn't make sense. "Maybe it's some kind of sick joke," he suggested, but the tone in his voice made it clear he didn't believe it either. When I got home after that, I decided to check the spots marked in the notebook. One of them was just a few blocks away from my apartment, in a park I used to visit with Luna. I don't know what made me brave enough to go, but I felt like I needed to understand, even if I didn't know what for. When I got there, I started looking for something out of the ordinary, and that's when I saw it. A wooden bench with burn marks, like someone had used it to put out cigarettes. Hanging from a branch above it was a small round mirror, the kind you get at cheap stores. When I got closer, I noticed that it reflected straight toward the entrance of my building. It was like it had been placed there to monitor who came in and out. My heart raced. Whoever it was, they had been watching me. That night I got a visit from a friend, Jake. He was the type of person who always saw things logically. I showed him the photos and the notebook, hoping maybe he could give me an explanation that would make sense. But, to my surprise, he seemed even more worried than I was. "Man, this isn't normal," he said, flipping through the notebook carefully. "Whoever this is, they're obsessed. Honestly, I think you should go to the police." But the idea of involving the cops didn't feel right. What would I say? Someone's been taking pictures of me for years, but I have no idea who or why. They'd probably just think I was paranoid. Jake insisted that at least I should install cameras in my apartment, and I ended up agreeing. He even helped me buy and set them up that same night. We put one at the entrance, one in the living room, and one in the hallway leading to my bedroom. After he left, I felt a little safer, but still I couldn't sleep well. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange noise coming from the living room, like something had fallen. My heart pounding, I grabbed the kitchen knife that had been sitting on my nightstand and went to check. When I got there, everything seemed fine, but Luna was hiding under the couch, meowing softly. Something had scared her, and that only made my anxiety worse. The next morning, I checked the camera footage, hoping not to find anything. But what I saw froze me in my tracks. At 3:14 a.m., a man with a wide-brimmed hat appeared in the corner of the living room camera. He didn't enter, didn't do anything. He just stood there, in the shadows, like he knew exactly where the camera was, and was trying to avoid being captured entirely. He stayed there for about 5 minutes before disappearing back into the darkness. My stomach dropped. Whoever he was, he knew where I lived. And worse, he had been inside the building, probably standing outside my apartment door. At that moment, I realized this wasn't just some mystery to solve. It was something dangerous. After watching the footage, I panicked. My first reaction was to grab my phone and call Jake. He showed up in less than 20 minutes, with a worried look on his face that I had never seen before. We decided together that I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. We gathered the photos, the notebook, and the video from the camera, and went straight to the police station. The officer who listened to our story seemed to pay attention, but in the end, he gave us that skeptical look. "We'll look into it, but there's not much we can do without identifying the person," he said. We were at a dead end, but I left copies of everything with them, hoping they would at least make an official report. That night, Jake insisted on sleeping on my living room couch, and I was grateful for it. It was comforting to have someone around, But even so, the atmosphere in the apartment felt heavier than ever. With every noise in the building, the tension grew. When I finally managed to fall asleep, I had a horrible nightmare. I was back in the same storage unit, surrounded by the photos, while the man in the hat stood by the door, laughing in a way that made my bones chill. I woke up in a cold sweat and realized that, even with someone there with me, I still didn't feel safe. 2 days later, I got a call from the police station. The officer sounded flustered. He said they had reviewed the camera footage, but in the video I had given them, there was no one, nothing. No man in the hat, no strange movements. He suggested I might have been mistaken, or that the video could have been altered somehow before it got to them. That completely shook me. I knew what I had seen. Jake had seen it too. But now, even he seemed to be starting to doubt. "Are you sure you weren't just so tired that you imagined it?" he asked, with a look of guilt that annoyed me deeply. In the days that followed, nothing else happened. The man in the hat didn't show up, and there were no new signs. But the impact of it all stayed with me. I couldn't stay in that apartment anymore. I moved out a few weeks later, to a place farther away, in a different city. The photos and the notebook? They're still in a box at the back of my closet, but I can't bring myself to look at them without feeling that shiver down my spine. To this day, I don't know who that man was or why he was watching me. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I feel like I'm still being watched. And no matter how hard I try to ignore it, that feeling never completely goes away. I've never been one to go out alone much, but that morning something made me get in the car and head to that diner. It was one of those simple, almost hidden places, with the smell of coffee and bacon that hugs you as soon as you walk in. The kind of place that feels more like an 80s horror movie than an actual restaurant. I'd left to clear my head, a little lost in my own thoughts, and didn't think twice when the door closed behind me. The waitress, who seemed to have a million things to do, pointed me to a corner table. I grabbed my coffee, opened the paper, and sunk into those scribbled pages with ads no one cared about anymore. The sound of the place, which should have been comforting, started to fade as I got lost in the news. That's when I heard the conversation. It wasn't about anything interesting, but the voice was so clear, so close, it pulled me back into reality. The couple in the booth behind me were talking with a kind of calm irritation. I don't usually eavesdrop, but their tone, the way they spoke, felt different. They were talking about a friend, or someone they knew, but I didn't catch the name right away. I was distracted, trying to make sense of a headline that didn't make any sense, but then the woman said, "So, have you talked to my name?" "I don't know, he's been acting weird." I froze. It wasn't a coincidence. The mention of my name was crystal clear. A chill ran down my spine. It couldn't be. I was in the middle of a busy place. The table was discreet, and no one knew who I was here. I stayed silent, trying to process what I had just heard. They kept talking like nothing had happened, but once I heard my name, my heart started racing. It was a strange feeling, like the room had suddenly narrowed, and I was being watched by something I couldn't see. No matter how much I tried to ignore it, the idea of them talking about me for no reason unsettled me deeply. But it didn't take long for something even stranger to happen. When the woman repeated, "I really don't know what's up with him, you know. My name has never been like this." The conversation stopped. The silence was so thick that even the sound of coffee being poured onto the table seemed to stop for a second. The man, who had been calm until that point, paused for a long moment, and that's when I noticed. He was looking at me. It wasn't just the casual look of someone noticing a stranger in a cafe, it was a stare. I couldn't focus on their conversation anymore. I couldn't look away. He was staring at me intently, and when our eyes met, it felt like the air around me grew heavier. Then he turned his head to the woman and said something, but I couldn't hear what it was. She looked at me too, and now I knew for sure. They were talking about me. I didn't know what to do. The anxiety hit me so hard that my body felt heavier. I wanted to get up and run out the door, but something was stopping me. Something I couldn't identify. Their eyes were still fixed on me. It wasn't just curiosity. It was like they were waiting for some sort of reaction, a response, something that would make sense of this situation that I could barely process. I tried looking at my coffee, the menu, but every time I lifted my eyes, there they were, staring at me. The man had a strange expression. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes were too intense. She, on the other hand, seemed calmer, but she wasn't looking away either. That's when I noticed something even more uncomfortable. The decor had changed. It wasn't an obvious change, but now it felt like the shadows in the corners of the room were deeper, like something was moving behind them. The diner, which had seemed normal before, now had this feeling of strangeness, like something horrible was about to happen. The fluorescent light hanging above my table flickered briefly, and for a second I swear I saw something. A shadow that moved along the wall. I didn't even know if it was real. I wanted to run, but my legs felt heavy, like they were buried in the ground. I was paralyzed, trapped in a place where the rules no longer made sense. "Are you going to follow us later?" The man's voice cut through the air and his question froze me. The way he said it, as if it was just the continuation of a conversation I should understand, made me sweat cold. Follow later? What did he mean by that? I didn't know what to say, but I felt the urgency in every word, every look. The woman smiled again, but this time it wasn't friendly. It was a forced smile, like she was trying to hide something from me. But I couldn't tell what it was anymore. I felt like I was being pulled into some twisted game where the rules were made by them, and I was playing without knowing the rules. I took a deep breath and tried to break free from my paralysis, finally standing up from my chair. I need to go," I managed to say, and my voice sounded strange, almost like it wasn't mine. The man and the woman didn't move, but their eyes were now glowing with an intensity that was unnerving, and that's when something in my mind clicked. I remembered something, a lost memory buried a long time ago. The feeling of being watched, being in a place where everything was wrong. I couldn't deny it anymore. I knew them. Not from any recent meeting or conversation, but from a distant past, from something I tried to forget, but that was now coming back to haunt me. They were part of a story I had tried to erase, but now it was returning to find me.